Hello and welcome to my channel. The following video is a compilation video where I put my entire Science vs. Evolution playlist into one single video, because some people like to have it all as one big long-ass video, while others prefer the playlist method. If you have not seen these videos before and prefer to watch them as individual videos in a playlist, I'll leave a card for that, but without further ado, here are those videos. Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today we're looking at a video from World Video Bible School, but we're going to give Kyle Butt a break for now and move on to Dr. Jeff Miller. Don't let that PhD fool you though. Once again, we're looking at someone who is allowed to call himself doctor, but isn't actually qualified in anything relevant to evolution. At least, I don't think his PhD in mechanical engineering is relevant, and while they're not exactly hiding the fact that his degree is irrelevant, it is right at the top of their main website after all, they also put it in the video without specifying that it's got nothing to do with biology, so if you only see the video on YouTube and never visit their website, you just know that he's a PhD who is talking about evolution, so you might wrongly assume that his PhD is relevant to evolution. Now this is part 1 of the WVBS series entitled Science vs. Evolution, which I plan on covering in its entirety. Now on to Dr. Jeff.
Come now and let us reason together.
Well, Pornhub is offering free premium memberships at the moment, so the first part of that is easy enough, but reasoning can be a bit difficult while in the refractory period.
That's what we're interested in doing. That's what we want to do in this seminar. We want to think, to use our heads, not just accept a belief, whether creation or evolution, without evidence.
Okay, good. I can agree that that is a good way to conduct an investigation. Then I can assume that you are, at some point in the series, actually going to present evidence specifically for creation rather than relying entirely on attempting to poke holes in the evidence for evolution, right? I mean, I understand that in order for your particular view of creation to be true, evolution must be dismantled, but even if you do successfully dismantle evolution, that does not prove creationism to be accurate. That just means that evolution is wrong. If the main suspect of a murder investigation is exonerated, that does not automatically make the secondary suspect guilty.
We want to examine the evidence and reason through to the appropriate conclusion, hopefully without bias. Seems like being unbiased would be a simple concept.
Yeah, it's simple in theory, but our brains work in weird ways to reinforce our previously held beliefs. This is why peer review is so important. Scientists submit their work to other scientists who have expertise in the field but no motivation to agree with the findings of their research, and so the reviewers will be able to find flaws in methodology that might not have been apparent to the original researchers. And this is why creationist research journals are so very useless. They usually have clauses in their publication guidelines specifically stating that papers will not be published if they go against certain predetermined conclusions. They willfully admit that they refuse to publish anything that is against their bias. Like this one from AIG, where the editor-in-chief reserves the right to refuse to publish anything he disagrees with. Or this statement of belief that all members of the Creation Research Society must subscribe to before they can be published in their quarterly research journal. Go read the submission guidelines for any reputable scientific journal, and if you can find me anything like this where they state that you have to have certain conclusions before they'll even consider publishing you, I'll send you $50. So before we even begin to look at the creation versus evolution debate, just look to see which side is insisting on their bias being accepted before they'll even consider publishing research.
But we know sometimes that's pretty difficult to do, because we tend to want to believe what we want to, whatever's convenient, without having to feel bad about it, without guilt. So it's easy to become biased against anything that goes against what we want to believe and practice.
Guilt doesn't necessarily come into the equation with biases. Guilt can result in certain cognitive biases, like motivated reasoning, but things like confirmation bias are not caused by guilt. They're caused by our previously held beliefs. If you believe that people act crazy when the moon is full, you don't feel guilty when you notice that people are acting crazy and the moon happens to be full. You also don't forget the times when people were acting crazy and the moon was not full because you felt guilty. You're just trying to set up the "they only believe evolution because they want to sin" line by planting the seeds of your idea before you fully elaborate on it. In other words, you are actively trying to create a bias so that when they hear you say the next thing, it makes sense despite not actually making sense.
Many are biased against evolution because of a strong desire to retain their belief in God in spite of whatever evidence they may have been presented with, and vice versa. Many are biased against creation, religion. Religion certainly can stand in the way of what we want to believe and practice at times. The idea of God carries with it many expectations that we just don't want to hear sometimes.
Okay, but what about all the Christians and people of other religions who accept evolution? Would it be fair to say that they are the least biased because they found a way to hold on to both viewpoints? Maybe there's a way to accept evolution without it threatening your faith, and maybe there's a way to have faith without having to reject science. There's a reason I often go to places like BioLogos for information on evolution. I am biased against religion, and I know that. But my argument is not with religion, it's with people who deny science. So when I am presenting science, I will use religious sources when I can to make it clear that I am not accepting the science out of a desire to reject God. The science is completely independent of a belief in God.
There are many positive proofs for the existence of God and the inspiration of the Bible. A listing of those proofs is not the goal of this seminar. You can see materials addressing those topics on our website, www.apologeticspress.org. In this seminar, we want to look at the opposite side of the coin, the main response to the creation model that is given by atheists today.
Great. So no support for your side in this entire series. Just you trying to poke holes in the evolution side. Wonderful.
Atheists, these are people who don't believe in God. Evolutionary theory is their response to the question of creation and origins.
Do I need to say it again? Have I not said it enough? It comes up in almost every creationist video. Should I repeat myself in every one of my videos on the matter? Okay, so here we go for the gazillionth time. There are more religious people of all the various faiths who accept evolution than there are atheists total. Even narrowing it down to just Christians, there are approximately 500 million atheists in the world. There are about 1.2 billion Roman Catholics in the world. The Roman Catholic Church's official position is that evolution is true. I do know that there are Catholics who deny evolution, though, so let's just pretend that half of the world's Catholics go against what their official church position is and deny evolution. That still leaves us with 600 million Catholics that accept evolution. So there are likely more Catholics who accept evolution than there are atheists total. And that's not even getting into the other Christian denominations or other religions. So please, creationists, stop claiming that evolution is the atheist response to the idea of God having created things, because that is just flat out wrong.
I want to qualify my argument about creation being scientific. I want to make sure I define my terms clearly.
I am all for making sure our terms are defined clearly. Does that mean we can expect a clear definition for what a kind is at some point in this series? Or information? That'd be nice, but I won't be holding my breath.
Just because someone calls himself a creationist, it doesn't mean that he's using logic and reason and the evidence from science to arrive at that conclusion.
No, I would go a bit further than that. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that someone who calls himself a creationist is actually most definitely not following the evidence to their conclusion.
The biblical portrait of faith is not what many in Christendom define it to be, believing something without evidence and even against reason and common sense.
So the Bible does not clearly define faith as being the assurance of things hoped for and the convictions of things not seen in Hebrews 11? This definition makes it rather obvious that faith does not have evidence. I mean, the Bible also says to be ready to give a defense of your faith, so yeah, it is possible to interpret that in other ways to make these two passages line up. But should that really be necessary? Was God unable to make his message clear? And besides which, if you're asserting that you have evidence for God and young earth creationism, if that's the case, faith need never enter the equation. Just present the evidence. You don't need faith if you actually have evidence, no matter how you define faith. Flip the script and define it as trust if you want, with that old bit about how we have faith that the couch won't collapse when you sit on it. Okay, that's trust based on previous experience. Previous experience certainly counts as a form of evidence, but in order to count as actual evidence, it does need to be repeatable. Is anything in creationism repeatable?
Biblical faith is like the trust we have in a parent or a friend. Do we blindly trust our parents? No, we trust them because they've proven themselves to be trustworthy. In other words, our faith is based on evidence.
Trust based on previous experience, yeah. Also, if we're following the Bible here, you kind of have to trust your parents because the Bible tells you to honor your parents, and if you want to strictly follow biblical law, it orders the death penalty for disobedience. So you really do have to trust and obey your parents in the biblical framework, because if you don't, you end up dead. But I feel like this whole half-hour video is going to be you pounding this point home. If you actually had evidence on your side, you wouldn't need a half-hour introduction to say that you have evidence, and at the same time point out that you're not going to present the evidence. You would just, present the evidence.
In this seminar, I argue that faith in naturalistic evolution, a doctrine in which atheists must believe,
Nope, that's not true at all. I have personally known atheists who do not believe in evolution. Evolution is not a universally held belief. And since there have been atheists for far longer than there has been a theory of evolution, I'm going to go ahead and say that belief in evolution is not a prerequisite for being an atheist. Though certainly atheists have no reason to reject the scientific consensus on the matter because there's really no bias there. Nothing about atheism insists that you accept evolution. But there's also nothing about atheism that insists that certain scientific ideas are off limits either, so you don't end up with very many atheists denying science based on their worldview.
That's actually a blind faith.
So, accepting the consensus of scientists who have spent their entire lives dedicated to studying evolution and its processes is blind faith rather than trust based on previous experience. But thinking that 99% of scientists across multiple fields, including biology, geology, and astronomy, are wrong, despite all appearances, the Earth is only 6,000 years old, and all the things that make it look older are the result of misinterpretation of evidence, is scientific? Seriously, just look at the fact that we have evidence of societies going on normally when there was supposed to have been a global flood. Combine that with an unbroken dendrochronological record that goes back thousands of years before you think the universe was created, and the fact that we have living organisms that are tens of thousands of years old, but no, it's the people who listen to scientists who are being unscientific.
People who believe in things for which there is no evidence are being, by definition, irrational. And this applies to both creationists and evolutionists. In the field of philosophy, what's known as the law of rationality is used to determine whether a person is being irrational or illogical.
Why is this a thing that creationists do? They always make up laws that nobody outside of creationism actually calls laws. There is the law of rational indices in chemistry with regards to crystal formation, but in philosophy there is no singular law of rationality. In fact, as with most things in philosophy, exactly what constitutes rationality is in dispute, with some holding to internalism, where being rational involves instrumental reason relative to your desires, so acting rationally is a matter of acting in a way that is conducive to the fulfillment of your desires. So say if you want to go skydiving, then booking skydiving lessons would be rational, even if external factors make that seem irrational. So if you're booking skydiving lessons with the money that you were supposed to use to pay rent, a philosopher who holds to internalism would still call that rational, but a philosopher who holds to externalism would call these skydiving lessons irrational, because externally, it is rational to fulfill your basic needs before considering your other desires. So it's the external factors that determine rationality. It goes deeper and gets more complicated than that, but I have a feeling that this basic understanding is already more than is necessary here. The next thing he does is just quote a bunch of Bible verses that could be loosely interpreted as stating that there is evidence for the God of the Bible, things like Romans, where it says the invisible attributes have been clearly seen, and Psalm 19, where it says that the heavens declare the glory of God. So I'm just going to skip all that.
So according to the creation model, there's evidence for creation.
According to the Bible, there is evidence that the Bible is true, yes. But the question here is whether or not this evidence points exclusively to the God of the Bible. And since Christians can't even agree universally on who the God of the Bible even is, that leaves me with the impression that any of the versions of God worshipped by any Christian denomination are not being pointed to exclusively by the Bible, much less any evidence that is external to the Bible.
We can examine nature and conclude that it points to God.
Even if it did point to a God, it doesn't get us specifically to any particular God. So maybe a God that can get along with the scientific consensus as to how old the universe is and how life diversified is one that is more highly evidenced than the young earth creationist God.
Now the naturalist, the atheist, argues that He bases his beliefs on things you can observe physically and argues that creationists can't observe God. So that makes me unscientific in his mind.
Poorly phrased as usual, but basically yes.
The National Academy of Sciences is an organization that heavily influences what's taught in schools and textbooks across America, and it's heavily influenced by naturalists today. Here's how they define science. One goal of science is to understand nature. The statements of science must invoke only natural things and processes. The statements of science are those that emerge from the application of human intelligence to data obtained from observation and experiment. Progress in science consists of the development of better explanations for the causes of natural phenomena.
Well, that's actually a few excerpts of the conclusion of Chapter 3 of the book Teaching About Evolution and the Nature of Science. If you want a definition of science itself, the intro to the chapter is probably a bit more concise. Science is a particular way of knowing about the world. In science, explanations are restricted to those that can be inferred from confirmable data, the results obtained through observations and experiments that can be substantiated by other scientists. In other words, if it can be observed, measured, and repeated, it can be part of science. If you have to mess with this definition in order to sneak creationism in as scientific, then creationism is not scientific. The only thing missing here is something that is touched on in part of the conclusion that you skipped, predictive power. The utility of science is that it makes predictions about how the world works, which is the basis of all modern technology. If we couldn't predict the behavior of transistors in a processor, then computers wouldn't exist. If we couldn't predict the amount of lift generated by an airplane's wing, then we wouldn't have flight. If we couldn't predict the rate at which yeast turns sugar into alcohol, we wouldn't have $300 bottles of wine.
Notice how much they emphasize natural, nature, observation. Anything supernatural has been kicked out of the classroom.
How would you go about conducting an experiment on something supernatural? What are its properties? Is it repeatable? Can independent scientists arrive at the same results when replicating your experiment? It's not just that they've excluded supernatural phenomena from science, it's that supernatural phenomena do not have explanatory or predictive power, and so are scientifically useless. There's also the fact that over time, natural explanations for observed phenomena have always, 100% of the time, replaced supernatural explanations. Never have we replaced a natural one with a supernatural one.
God, creation, that's not natural. You can't observe that, so it's unscientific.
Basically, yes.
Many of the greatest scientific minds of the past, the fathers of many scientific disciplines, were creationists who looked at science as a study that pointed to God. And yet the NAS won't even allow God in the classroom?
Yes. Many, I'd even go so far as to say most, of what we would call scientists have in the past been religious and have seen their work as a study of God's handiwork, whichever God they happen to believe in. Many scientists today are still religious. This indicates that God and science are not necessarily mutually exclusive. But just because they are not mutually exclusive does not mean that religion should be taught in a science classroom. Those are two completely different subjects. When studying how nature works, it is reasonable to expect the natural mechanisms are what are focused on. And if an unbiased study of nature and its mechanisms really and truly did point to your God, then you shouldn't be afraid of it.
Well, is creation unscientific? Really?
I mean, you were literally just complaining that we won't allow magic as an explanation in scientific research, so I'm going to go with yes.
Well, granted, we can't directly observe God. We can't taste, touch, hear, smell, or see Him, so we can't use empirical science to directly prove that God exists.
So then, by definition, the proposition God as an explanation for anything is unscientific.
But it doesn't follow that there's no physical evidence for His existence.
Sure, there might be scientific evidence that would point to a God, but it would have to point to God specifically, and that still doesn't get you to a point where saying God did it becomes a scientific explanation for anything. It just gets you to a point where, at best, the scientific explanation is an explanation of exactly how God did it.
Ironically, much of evolutionary science is based on indirect, not direct evidence.
Much of it, yes, but not all of it. Evolution itself has been directly observed, and even much of what you are calling indirect is still based on direct evidence. So, for instance, how do we know that a rock that we found a fossil in is a certain age? Well, we can measure the radioactive decay of some of the elements in the rock. This is a direct measurement of the decay rate. We have been measuring these decay rates for about the last century, and they have never been found to change outside of certain margins for error that are accounted for by imprecise measurements. We can then use this information to determine how long it would have taken for the radioactive elements in the rock to decay to their current levels, using methods that will directly determine whether your calculations of the initial levels of those elements are accurate, and will directly determine if there has been any contamination or loss of those elements. All of this is direct science, which has given us dates for rocks in the billions of years range. The best that creationists can do in this scenario is say that maybe the global flood changed the decay rates and made them all look older than they are. Never with any proposed mechanism for such a change that might be tested, just an assertion that it happened. In fact, the flood is usually the creationist escape hatch from any science that makes the Earth look old. Biogeography and paleontology, when taken together, demonstrate that the continents were together in the past. Must have been a global flood. What caused the tectonic plates to move so fast during the flood and so slow now? The fountains of the deep opened up. Okay, how did that happen? What caused it? God, obviously. Okay, but what mechanism did he use? That's the problem, right there. There is never any proposed testable mechanism, just assertions. And that is why it is not scientific.
Since no one has ever witnessed many of the fundamental premises of evolution, like abiogenesis.
Abiogenesis is not a fundamental premise of evolution. It is the logical conclusion of evolution extrapolated backward, but it is not a premise. The only premise is that life began and was less diverse when it began, and this is supported by direct evidence.
Matter spontaneously generating.
Do you mean the Big Bang? Because, once again, that's not evolution. Evolution is the process by which biological organisms diversified. Sure, they wouldn't diversify if there wasn't a universe in which to do it, but that doesn't make the origin of the universe part of the theory of evolution.
Creatures evolving across phylogenetic boundaries.
I assume you mean phylogenetic here, since phylogenic isn't a word. I've also heard plenty about such boundaries, but I've never heard exactly where they are supposed to be. Sometimes a bold creationist will say species, but then other creationists will fully admit that speciation is a thing that happens, and so they place it higher up. But never is a mechanism described that would stop the crossing of such boundaries. But in reality, evolution does not predict that phylogenetic boundaries would be crossed, assuming that you mean that some species will eventually evolve outside of its parent clades. No, we are still part of the categories that defined our ancestors. That's why we are all eukaryotes, and vertebrates, and mammals, and primates, etc.
A Big Bang creating a universe? These phenomena and others haven't been observed, and yet they're considered science.
Okay, if you're just going to come out and say Big Bang later, then what exactly did you mean by that whole matter spontaneously generating thing? But here's the thing about the Big Bang. Firstly, it was initially described by a devout Roman Catholic, so no trying to escape God there. Secondly, various religions latched onto the idea of the Big Bang because it provided them with a moment of creation. The leading hypothesis up to that point was that the universe was in a steady state. It had always been as it is now. That did not sit well with people who believed in creation, so the Big Bang was a validation for religious believers. Secondly, the model that predicted the Big Bang also made other predictions, which have since been validated. For instance, the existence of the cosmic microwave background radiation. The CMB was predicted by the math of the Big Bang long before we had the technology to directly observe it. But when we developed that technology, guess what we found? The CMB, right where it was supposed to be. That's a really neat trick if the Big Bang theory is wrong. So if you suggest that the Big Bang is indeed wrong, then you need to have a model that satisfies all of the same predictions it has made, and then some.
They're allowed to be kept in the classroom, the textbooks, and creation isn't, when both are based on indirect evidence.
The main difference here is that the Big Bang has made testable predictions that have since been verified. Can creationism say the same? No, it cannot. Okay, so I'm less than halfway through his half-hour video, and my video is getting to be about a half hour as well, so I'm going to cut it off here. Most of the rest of his video is actually kind of irrelevant here. He just goes into an explanation as to why the young Earth creationist view of Christianity is the correct one, and he uses arguments that even AIG would disagree with. For instance, he says that in Genesis, the word yom is used rather than another word that can mean an unspecified period of time. Except Ken Ham himself will tell you that an unspecified period of time is one of the 4 potential meanings for the word yom. He also says that the Hebrews would not have developed a 7-day week if it were a metaphor. They would have had a week where they worked 6 long unspecified periods of time before resting on a 7th long unspecified period of time. Because I guess interpreting metaphors is a foreign concept to him? It's all theological debate, though, trying to convince other Christians that his Christianity is the right one. So while it is amusing to watch him flail around desperately for an argument, it is irrelevant. But he does eventually swing back and basically repeat what I've already covered here, but he does clarify what he means when he says evolution, so I will make that the last part of his video that I will cover.
So in this seminar, when I use the term evolution, I'm using it in the way many naturalists use it. The theory of how the universe got here, not just species. Materialists, naturalists, atheists use the term evolution as a catch-all word, and they simply lump the entire history of the universe into the word evolution.
Nope. You're getting atheists, materialists, and naturalists confused with creationists here. On this channel, I have to constantly point out, as I have in this very video, that evolution as a scientific theory only applies to biological diversity. The word evolution can be used colloquially to just mean change over time for pretty much anything, so sometimes people will speak of things like the evolution of cell phones and whatnot. But when speaking scientifically, evolution has a very specific meaning, and it has nothing to do with the origin of the universe. That's it for today. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Marilyn Newman, who says, "Okay, this exceeded my gag reflex. 16 minutes and 15 seconds in. An hour and 1 minute and 43 seconds is the total runtime." So yeah, this was on my live stream where Mrs. Rhino and I watched episode 1 of Salty, and it was something. I do not recommend. Thanks for watching. Special thanks, as always, to my patrons, who are the 3D printers that are making face shields for my healthcare workers. Not finishing that with a joke today, just that if you have a 3D printer, call your local hospitals to see if they could use something like these 3D printed face shields and start printing. See you next time! Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today we're looking at part 2 of World Video Bible School's Science vs. Evolution series. Part 2 is titled, Can Evolution Get Something from Nothing? So before watching it, I can already tell where they're going. They are going to attempt to falsify evolution, which is defined as the change in allele frequencies in a population over successive generations, by pointing out that it doesn't explain where the universe came from. Because allele frequencies and populations are totally relevant to the origin of the universe, right? So let's go!
The laws of science stand in the way of naturalistic evolution. If anything can be said to be scientific, it's the laws of science, since they have been formulated based on mounds and mounds of scientific evidence that substantiates them beyond a reasonable doubt.
So you trust scientists and the scientific community when they give us the laws of science, but for some reason you don't trust these same people when they explain how life diversified? Why do you trust them for one of these, but not the other?
The first big question, which is yet unanswered by the evolutionist, that illustrates the fact that evolution requires a blind faith, why do the laws of science even exist? Where do they come from? Who wrote them?
Is the origin of the scientific laws really supposed to be described by evolution? Can you not accept that alleles vary in populations over generations and accept that some supreme being wrote the laws of science? But that's irrelevant, really. As it turns out, what we call the laws of science are descriptive rather than prescriptive. In other words, we wrote the laws of science. All they do is attempt to describe how things work. If things worked differently, we would have different scientific laws to describe them. The laws of science are actually pretty boring with regards to this conversation. They just describe facts. It is a fact that the pressure exerted by a given mass of an ideal gas will be inversely proportional to the volume it occupies if the temperature and amount of gas remain the same. If instead it exerted a pressure that was directly proportional to the volume it occupied, the law would reflect that fact instead. What it comes down to is that the answer to the question, who wrote the scientific laws, is us. We wrote them, as a description of our observations.
Without a lawmaker, how could they even exist?
I don't think adding a big, complicated supernatural being into the equation really helps matters. It just complicates things. We use scientific laws to describe how the universe works. This does not mean that someone made the universe work that way. It just means that's how it is. If there is a reason for it, we're not going to discover that reason by suggesting magic as the answer.
Humanist Martin Gardner wrote a few years ago, "Imagine that physicists finally discover all the basic waves and their particles and all the basic laws and unite everything in one equation. We can then ask, why that equation? And why are there quantum laws? There's no escape from the super ultimate questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why is the something structured the way it is?"
Yes, he did say that. And shockingly, there isn't anything particularly damning to you in the ellipses of this quote. But it does bear mentioning that this is toward the end of his book, where he's discussing science and its relationship to the unknowable. Specifically, he brings this up to point out that the feeling of awe and wonder that we have is the result of some things being completely incomprehensible to us.
Even if the naturalist ignores the little problem of how the universe came into existence in the first place, he still has the problem of how the laws that govern that matter came into being as well.
Not really. It's a question that we don't have the answer to yet. And what is science, if not the pursuit of answers that we don't have? It's a very big question to be sure, and one that we might never have a satisfying answer for. But just because we do not yet know the answer to a question in cosmology does not mean that essentially all of biology is wrong. That doesn't logically follow at all. That's like me saying that if you don't know the answer to 2,329 times 4,652, then mixing vinegar and baking soda won't produce a bubbly endothermic reaction.
Why are there specific equations and specific numbers that describe how things work?
It being possible to describe how things work does not automatically mean that that thing was designed. If E equals mc squared were not a valid equation, we would not use that equation. We would have developed a different equation that reflects the workings of this hypothetically different reality. If bananas were not yellow, we would not call them yellow.
Equations, by definition, are not random.
I am entirely unaware of the existence of any person who would think to suggest that equations are random.
They indicate structure, design, intent, planning, a mind.
They indicate none of those things. What they do indicate is a description of how things are, nothing more.
Those kinds of words can't be used to describe random chance processes and chaos.
If the universe operated on random chance and chaos, then no, we would not be able to use equations to describe the operation of the universe. But again, this does not indicate that there was a designer. It just indicates that the universe does not operate on the principles of random chance and chaos,
which are words that describe evolution.
I have never heard anyone describe evolution as random chance and chaos that is not on the creationist side of the debate. If you oppose evolution, yet you cannot even accurately describe it, how can you claim to understand it well enough to discredit it?
Bottom line, someone had to write the laws for the universe to follow. The atheistic evolutionary community admits that it doesn't have an answer to the question of the origin of the scientific laws. They admit it and move along like it's not a big deal.
It is a big deal. It is very much a big deal. That's why there are theoretical physicists and cosmologists who spend their careers trying to understand these very questions. But as I pointed out earlier, having an unanswered question does not make God the answer, nor does this unanswered question of cosmology falsify the foundation of modern biology.
But wait a minute. If there isn't a reasonable answer to that question, atheism is false before we even get started.
Who said there isn't a reasonable answer to that question? We just don't know the answer. There might well be a reasonable answer to the question that we are incapable of grasping yet. There might not be an answer that we will ever be capable of grasping. But one thing remains true. Not having an answer to a question does not make magic a reasonable answer to the question.
If there's no answer to how the laws could come about naturally, then the evidence points to the supernatural, and God should be allowed back in the science classroom.
Because any old answer that you can just pull out of your butt is better than no answer, right? This is one of those spots where you're trying to just use our lack of knowledge as a means of stuffing your God into that gap of our knowledge. If you can demonstrate how the existence of a God actually meaningfully answers this question, then we can consider it to be an option. Otherwise, the answer just boils down to we don't know, so it must have been magic. And I know you don't like my use of the word magic, but it is an apt description. If you are taking the Bible literally, it literally says that God created everything through the power of his speech, which perfectly fits the description of a magical incantation. If you don't like this comparison, then you need to provide me with more than just we don't know, so God is the answer.
Especially since the classroom is his anyway. Stephen Hawking believes that quantum mechanics could create a universe from nothing before the supposed Big Bang happened, which he also believes in. But again, even if that were true and the evidence stands against it, see our website, www.apologeticspress.org, for more on that subject. Hawking himself still had to ask the questions. Did God create the quantum laws that allowed the Big Bang to occur? In a nutshell, did we need a God to set it all up so that the Big Bang could bang? Now, his stubborn answer was no, but the problem is he couldn't provide answers to those questions. He couldn't even attempt an explanation. And yet he still flat out rejects the idea of a God whose existence would actually give him a reasonable answer to the problem.
Is God really a reasonable answer to the problem? Now remember, we're talking the origin of the universe here, something that Stephen Hawking was a celebrated expert in. He had answers that most of us are incapable of even imagining, and he had the math to back it up. So he had reason to believe that the universe is billions of years old, and that the Big Bang is how it all got started. If he then admits ignorance on the question of how the various universal laws and constants and whatnot ended up being what they are, that does nothing to change the age of the universe or the fact that the Big Bang happened. So even if you are 100% correct in that the appropriate thing to do here is to stuff God into that gap of our knowledge, which you aren't, but if you were right, then evolution, billions of years, and the Big Bang are still real things that you need to come to terms with.
How could a law of nature exist without a law writer?
How can a yellow banana exist without a banana yellower?
A law of science cannot evolve itself into existence from an explosion. The law has to already be in existence in order to govern the nature of the explosion.
Apparently, people who accept evolution think that the laws of science evolved now. Who knew?
One of the things that I'll try to point out over and over in these sessions is that while the naturalistic model has no reasonable explanation for several critical points in the universe, the creation model is perfectly in keeping with the evidence.
Being able to pull an unfalsifiable explanation out of your butt when the fact is that we don't yet have an answer does not make your answer magically fit with the evidence. The Big Bang is what happened when the cosmic giant who lives outside of space and time sneezed. There, I answered it, and my answer here is just as good as your answer. Better even, because I gave a mechanism for the Big Bang, the sneeze. Do you have a mechanism to describe how your God did anything that you claim he did? No? Okay then, I'll just wait for you to prove my cosmic giant wrong before I even begin to consider taking your position seriously.
In the same way that a poem requires a poet, a law requires a law writer, always, without exception. No human can point to an example of a law existing without there being a law writer that wrote it.
Well, that depends very much on whether or not the laws of nature were actually created by a god of some kind. You have still done nothing to demonstrate this god's existence. So at the moment, the authorship status of the laws of nature is unknown. If it turns out that a god wrote them, then sure, you'd be right. But if it turns out that that's just the way it is, or there's some other reason for them being the way they are, then those laws are the ones that we can point to. Just because you can analogize them to legal laws and poetry does not mean your analogy is correct.
Recall that according to the McGraw-Hill Dictionary of Scientific and Technical Terms, a scientific law is a regularity which applies to all members of a broad class of phenomena. Not some, all. There are no known exceptions to the laws of science.
Except that sometimes exceptions are laid out within the laws themselves. For instance, Boyle's law specifies that it is applicable to a closed system of constant temperature, which means that in an open system it does not apply. Now, usually scientific laws are laid out in a way that make them only applicable in very specific and uncommon scenarios, but they can be generally applicable to more broad situations that don't specifically fit the criteria, with the understanding that there will be a certain degree of imprecision for these applications. For instance, when looking at the laws of thermodynamics, if you know how much water is in a glass and what temperature the water is, and you have an ice cube of known volume and temperature, then you can calculate the final temperature of the water once the ice cube melts into it, and you can do so while mostly ignoring the temperature of the room that the glass of water is in, even though realistically this will have an effect on the end result.
So if a scientific theory is developed which contradicts those laws and speculates that the laws could be broken, that theory is unscientific.
Well, in order for it to become a scientific theory, it first has to be incredibly well supported and have excellent explanatory power for several observed phenomena. So if it appears to break any scientific laws, then that would demonstrate a lack of understanding of that specific aspect of the theory or a lack of completeness of our understanding of the law, rather than the entire theory being wrong. Evolution, though, doesn't even come close to breaking any known scientific laws.
So the box is the exterior boundary of the whole universe, the blast radius of the Big Bang, if you're a naturalist. Everything in the universe is in that box. It represents a closed system.
And how have you determined the nature of the boundaries of the universe? How did you determine that it is indeed a closed system? How have you, a mechanical engineer, come by this knowledge that has so far escaped theoretical physicists, cosmologists, and astronomers?
Which means nothing is going into the box because everything in the universe is already in the box, and nothing is going out of the box because the boundary of our box is big enough to encompass everything in the universe.
You know, creationists are so fond of science based on direct observation. So I am really curious how you have observed the boundaries of the universe to determine that nothing actually can travel in or out of the universe. If you're just using an intuitive sense about how things work, then just keep in mind that with physics and cosmology at the scales that you are speaking on are often completely counterintuitive. For instance, in November, scientists took a close look at some anomalies in the cosmic microwave background radiation and have determined that they would be accounted for if space-time were slightly curved. The consensus at the moment is that the universe is flat, like a sheet of paper. That means that you can travel in any direction, and as long as you keep a straight line, you won't end up back where you started. But in a curved universe, you would. This also means that parallel lines will eventually intersect. Stuff that our monkey brains that evolved to survive on the African plains never needed to understand for that survival, and as such is completely counterintuitive. Of course, they may be wrong, they're going against the consensus, which means they need to bring a lot more to the table than they would if their findings supported the consensus, so more research needs to be done before we start running around saying that all cosmologists were wrong about the shape of the universe. But my point is that it is far more complicated a topic than just, it makes sense to me, therefore that's how it is.
According to the creation model, before day one, the box was empty. And God essentially opened that box, created the universe, put it in the box, and then closed it and sealed it so that nothing else could enter or leave the box. So the box has remained closed since then, except at those times when God engaged in miraculous activity, that is, activity that momentarily put the laws of physics on hold and allowed God to do something that was not natural, something that was above nature or supernatural.
Okay, so the universe is a closed system, except when I need it to not be a closed system. And no, I can't demonstrate that because you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. So you have brought to the table a completely unfalsifiable proposition stuffed with special pleading that doesn't have any explanatory power and wouldn't be useful anyway. Great.
Now, as I said before, someone put it, no one put it, or it put itself. So which option's right? Which one is in keeping, in harmony with the evidence? Creation, spontaneous generation, or eternality?
I skipped most of his analogy, he took too long to go through it, but it was, if you find a box with a ping pong ball inside, the three options are that someone put it there, no one put it there, or it put itself there. Of course, this is a flawed analogy because ping pong balls and boxes don't behave in the same way as a universe compressed into a singularity, so once again our intuitions on the matter are rather useless. And while the someone put it there option feels right, because we as agents who have agency detecting mechanisms built into our brains can understand that, it still doesn't describe the mechanism. Scientists are doing their work to describe the mechanisms at work that ended up with our universe. So if the someone put it there, they used the mechanisms that science is discovering.
Well, in the words of Sherlock Holmes, said back in 1890, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Yes, and that is known in some circles as the Holmes fallacy. For that to be true, you would first have to determine that you have considered every possible option. How can you ever consider an option that you don't even know exists? How can you ever verify that you have indeed considered every single last option, that there isn't some unconsidered option that has eluded you? Just because a fictional character that was supposed to be really smart said it does not make it accurate.
Now, if you choose the atheist route, the naturalist, then obviously you eliminate the creator option from the table, and you're left with only two possibilities for the origin of the universe. And in order to attempt to be rational, the atheist has to believe in one of these possibilities, since he doesn't believe in God.
Yes, if we remove the magical dude who breaks all the laws of science from the table, we are left with non-magical answers. That is true.
Either spontaneous generation, so in other words, the self-creation of the universe, or the eternality of matter. In other words, that it is self-existent. Now,
okay, you need to stop using that term the way you're using it. Spontaneous generation was a specific hypothesis, and one that was found to be wrong in the 1800s, and has never been a part of cosmology. Usually creationists conflate it with abiogenesis, but you seem to think it applies to anything just beginning to exist without a magical helper. Instead of filling your talk with a bunch of technical jargon and then re-explaining it in simpler terms, just stick to the simpler terms. In cases like this, they're more accurate anyway.
to the box is empty, we're in the box. The spontaneous generation model claims that no one put matter in the universe. It put itself here. So according to the spontaneous generation model, you could stand around inside of that box just staring into nothingness, and given enough time, all of a sudden, pop, something could just appear. Not only could something pop into existence, but according to this version of the model, a little ball containing all of the mass and energy of the entire universe just popped into existence.
Yes, according to the model that explains how we could get a universe from nothing, an actual nothing is unstable and will produce something, and the energy of the something that is produced will add up to zero, so no thermodynamic laws need to be broken. So in this instance, gravity is negative energy and matter and energy are positive energy. Yes, this is completely counterintuitive. That does not make it wrong.
But there's a problem with that idea. Evolutionist Willard Young explained the first law of thermodynamics correctly when he said in describing it that energy can be neither created nor destroyed, but can only be converted from one form to another.
Yes, and if the total energy of the universe does indeed add up to zero, then energy was not created nor destroyed when the universe came into being. This would make the very existence of the universe the ultimate free lunch.
Nothing's going to pop into existence from nothing. Not an atom, a tree, a fish, an ape, a human, certainly not a small sphere containing all of the energy of the entire universe. It's not going to happen. According to the first law of thermodynamics, which remember has no known exceptions, there's never been an exception to the law witnessed, so by implication, it would be unscientific. It would go against the laws of science to believe that matter could have come into being in such a way that the first law of thermodynamics was violated.
Unless the total energy of the universe is actually zero, then no energy would have needed to come into existence.
I must admit that there are yet no empirical or observational tests that can be used to test the idea of an accidental origin. What? Part of the naturalist's own definition of science includes the ability to observe and test a theory.
To observe and test an hypothesis, a theory is a collection of facts, data, and hypotheses. And yes, science must make testable predictions. One of the methods for testing predictions is through mathematical modeling, and that's primarily what is used for early universe cosmology. But yeah, we don't have a way to directly test what would have happened before the Big Bang, and our math and physics just break down at that point. In other words, at the moment, it is impossible to say which hypothesis about the origin of the universe is correct. Just because you can assert confidently that yours is correct does not make it scientific. You have to come up with a test for it, a model that makes predictions based on your hypothesis. If you successfully build a model that actually accounts for all of the data we have so far and points directly to a creator, you'd probably win a Nobel Prize in physics. But instead of putting in any actual work, you just assert that scientists are wrong because of one of the most basic scientific principles that every single one of them is already aware of.
Stephen Hawking attempts to argue that the universe could pop into existence since he believes there's a zero energy balance in the universe now, and there was zero energy before the cosmic egg appeared. But even if he could prove that there's a zero energy balance in the entire universe now, which he can't, he still admits that there was no energy in the universe before, and now there is energy, regardless of whether or not it balances out due to its positive and negative signs.
You should know better. You're a mechanical engineer. Thermodynamics should be something that you are intimately familiar with. In simplified language, it states that the total energy of an isolated system remains constant. Now, I think you are more aware of this than you're letting on, because you've been describing the universe as a closed system thus far, but a closed system is different from an isolated system. In a closed system, the matter must stay within the system, but the energy is free to enter and or leave. Think of a covered pot on a stove. The water stays in the pot, but the energy is added to the water through the heating element. That is essentially a closed system, but the energy in the pot increases. So your proposal that the universe is a closed system would allow energy from outside to enter in, so that leaves a backdoor for God. But then you're talking about the scientific perspective as if the universe is instead an isolated system so that you can close this backdoor. But if the universe is an isolated system, as you have been trying to imply, then it doesn't matter, thermodynamically speaking, what's going on with the energy within the system as long as the total stays the same. So if it starts with 0, it will always have a total of 0, even if that total is the result of adding up positive and negative energy rather than there just being nothing.
Scientific laws describe regularities that apply to all scenarios that the law applies to. In order for something to be a law, scientists could never have observed any exception to the rule.
Okay, but the laws of science are our understanding of how the universe works. No observed exceptions can exist, but if we do at some point observe an exception, which is more likely, that fallible human scientists have an incomplete understanding of how the universe works, or magic? Now, certainly for anything that we call a scientific law now to be broken would require a very large amount of evidence before it would begin to be accepted by scientists, but that does not make magic a better explanation. And this has happened. Newton's laws of motion, while still described as laws, are not entirely accurate, because Newton didn't know about the theory of relativity. They will work well enough on scales that we are familiar with to still be considered laws, but our understanding of them was incomplete until Einstein came along. And in fact, our understanding is still incomplete. Now, it may be completed by the development of a quantum theory of gravity, but that remains to be seen, as we don't have that yet.
But notice, the creation model does not contradict the first law of thermodynamics. The first law says that in nature, nothing, matter, mass, energy, nothing's going to pop into existence from nothing. It will not be created on its own. Believing in such an idea is like believing in witchcraft.
Witchcraft, which the Bible says is a real thing and takes so seriously that it has the death penalty for practicing it. So a belief in biblical creation basically necessarily comes with a belief in witchcraft, yet here you are saying that our current "we don't know for sure, so let's keep trying to figure it out" model of universal origins is like believing in witchcraft. Well, since you must believe in witchcraft, that must mean that you don't find the non-creation models to be all that far-fetched after all.
What about the other option? Could matter be eternal?
That depends on what you mean by eternal. If you mean having existed for an infinite amount of time, then probably not. If you mean the matter existed before time began, then possibly. That's the Hartle-Hawking state, the idea that the matter and the energy of the universe existed before time, as much as that can mean anything, and so talking about the beginning of matter and energy is nonsensical because you can't have a beginning without time. So in this case, matter and energy have existed for as long as time has existed, and time seems to have existed for about 13.77 billion years.
Well, it means that the universe could not have always existed and we still have usable energy. According to the second law of thermodynamics, if the universe is infinitely old, we shouldn't have any usable energy left. Everything should be completely worn out and deteriorated.
Yeah, that's not what anyone that I am aware of is proposing with the idea of the universe having always existed. And this applies to your eternal God as well, at least if you don't want to be breaking the laws of physics, it does. If God is eternal, then where did he get the energy from to create the universe? His energy should have reached a point of maximum entropy by now too. Why does your model get to break the laws of physics? Why do you get a special exception? Because of magic. You are literally proposing magic as the solution.
And yet we have an abundant amount of usable energy in the universe, in harmony with the creation model, which says that the universe is relatively young, on the order of 6,000 to 10,000 years old.
And aside from the idea of the universe being only 10,000 years old, flying in the face of everything that is known about physics, astronomy, biology, geology, anthropology, paleontology, and pretty much any other ology that you care to look at, that still doesn't get you out of having broken the second law of thermodynamics, because you claim that God is eternal, so his energy should be at maximum entropy. Oh, but he lives outside of time. Yeah, and the Hartle-Hawking state basically says the same thing about the origin of the universe, so if it works for you, it works for us as well. Except the version that we have on our side has a bunch of math and physics behind it, whereas you have yet to even so much as hint at a mechanism of any kind that God might have made use of.
Now, to develop a theory that requires breaking the laws of thermodynamics would be unscientific.
Okay, so creationism is unscientific.
When God engaged in miraculous activity, that is, activity that momentarily put the laws of physics on hold.
Got it.
Evidence, all of which supports the idea that nothing lasts forever.
So you would agree that nothing lasts forever? So you don't believe that you get an eternal existence in heaven when you die? Or does heaven's breaking of the laws of thermodynamics not count for some reason? Well, that's it for this one. He doesn't say anything new or profound for the rest of the video. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Screaming Cactus, who says, God and science are like oil and water. You can hold them in the same glass, but you can't make them mix. I like that analogy because you can accept science and believe in God, but science cannot be informed by the God belief because the idea of a God is outside of the realm of science. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my patrons, especially Mark McManus, who are the Winnie to my Pooh. If you'd like to support the show for as little as $1 per week, you can do so over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other methods of support, like direct donations or Amazon wish lists, can be found in the description, as can my social media and P.O. Box address. See you next time! Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm continuing on with the World Video Bible School's Science vs. Evolution playlist. I'm skipping number 3. Well, kind of. Even though it's a half-hour long, he doesn't really make enough of a point in it to warrant a video of its own, so a summary of 3. He presents the principle of causality as if it is a scientific law, which it isn't, words it in a way that excludes it from applying to God without giving any reason for that wording, he actually pretends that that's the scientific wording, and declares victory because every material effect needs a cause, and since God is immaterial, he can be the cause without an effect of its own. Yay! Checkmate atheists! That's his whole half-hour video summarized in a few seconds. Rebuttal: within seconds of looking into causality as it applies to science, specifically physics, the first thing I find is that it is referenced as being applicable to classical physics, which means that it is not necessarily applicable in quantum physics. What it boils down to is that causality is not as cut and dry as he makes it out to be, and this fact renders his entire video one big moot point. On to video number 4, in which he finally stops talking about cosmology in his series that is supposed to be about evolution, and finally gets into some biology. Though we're not quite at the actual theory of evolution yet, this one is about abiogenesis. So let's go!
Let's look at 2 other areas of science that shed light on the creation-evolution question. Consider the well-known, highly respected law of biogenesis, a law which describes how life works, where life comes from in nature.
And I'm sure you're not going to conflate spontaneous generation with abiogenesis here at all, right? Because the principle of biogenesis was developed as a refutation of the idea that fully formed complex life could spontaneously arise from inanimate matter. People once didn't know that maggots came from fly eggs. They just knew that if they left meat out long enough, maggots would appear on it. They didn't know that mold spores are floating around in the air all the time. They just knew that mold would grow on food if it was left out too long. This is what spontaneous generation refers to, and it was this idea that biogenesis refuted.
In order for atheistic evolution to be possible, the atheist must have an explanation for the origin of life without the need of a creator.
No, that's not even slightly true. We can all agree that life started at some point in the past. Nobody is disputing this. And since the vast majority of the evidence points to life appearing on Earth between 3.7 and 4.2 billion years ago, it stands to reason that the creationist model of life being plunked here 6,000 years ago is in error. If you want to believe that abiogenesis is impossible, that's fine. You're welcome to believe that God gave life a kickstart, but that does not invalidate evolution, even if it ended up being true. So if, in this video, you somehow manage to prove that abiogenesis is 100% impossible, you still haven't even begun to disprove evolution.
So ultimately, in the evolutionary model, life had to come into existence from non-living substances.
Yes, and since life is literally made out of non-living substances, this follows. Carbon is not alive. Oxygen is not alive. Neither are hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, or magnesium. But these elements make up some 99.9% of your body mass. You, a living entity, are made of these non-living substances. So in both of our models, life comes from non-living substances. But in the evolutionary model, the scientific model, we don't need to appeal to supernatural forces to fill in the gaps of our knowledge.
For millennia, up to a few hundred years ago, it was a common belief that life could in fact spring into existence from non-life, just pop into existence on its own, a belief known as spontaneous generation or abiogenesis.
Called it. I wish you guys weren't so predictable. Yes, for thousands of years, the belief was that pest organisms that show up when food spoils were popping into existence by feeding on the life force that is seeping out of the dead material that is the food. After all, we need to eat the food and consume its life force in order to sustain our life force, right? So it stands to reason that if you leave it unconsumed for long enough, the life force would leak out and make all sorts of nasty little beasties appear. That is spontaneous generation, the apparition of fully developed life forms from dead, previously living material. Biogenesis refuted that idea. Abiogenesis is the hypothesis that life originated by a series of chemical reactions that would have resulted in very simple, basic, single-celled life. And several aspects of abiogenesis have been experimentally demonstrated. Simple protocells behave in a very lifelike manner that have been shown to form out of just 5 chemicals. They're able to move, exhibit population-level behavior, seek out food sources, reproduce, and even solve a maze. And this is without any sort of genetic material. In fact, Martin Hanschek, the researcher who performed this experiment, pointed out that the simple 5 chemical protocells were far too simple for what would have been found on the early Earth, as there would have been many more chemicals and compounds present there than in a sterile lab. So he repeated the experiment with protocells filled with tar, similar to what would have been on the early Earth, and he was still able to develop protocells with lifelike behaviors.
Then in the 1600s, Italian scientist Francesco Redi conducted scientific tests which cast serious doubt on the idea of spontaneous generation.
Yes, Redi demonstrated that maggots always come from fly eggs, using the experiment of putting a piece of meat in a container that is sealed off from the environment but not airtight. This prevents the flies from being able to lay eggs on the meat, and maggots would instead appear on the cloth that was keeping them from getting to the meat. He also placed dead flies and dead maggots on the meat in sealed jars to demonstrate that they weren't just generating from dead flies or maggots close by. What is the relevance of this to abiogenesis? Absolutely none, but I'll bet you don't even mention that this was entirely about maggots on meat.
But some were skeptical of his experiments and still thought that abiogenesis could occur.
And that is why you can't talk about the details of the experiment, because I don't think anyone would be fooled into thinking that this has any relevance to modern abiogenesis if you actually laid out that it's about flies and maggots appearing on spoiled meat. No, abiogenesis was not a thing back then. Some were skeptical that this disproved spontaneous generation, though, because while it did demonstrate that flies propagate from other flies, it did not demonstrate that fungi only propagate from other fungi. So in 1729, Pier Antonio Michelli, I'm not sure, I'm bad with Italian names, experimented by manually placing fungal spores on slices of melon, and he observed that the same type of fungi would grow from these spores as the fungi that the spores were originally harvested from, demonstrating that fungi did not come from spontaneous generation either. And fun fact, by reading past that paragraph in the book, I have now learned of a fungus called smut, with spores that can be referred to as smut dust. So that's fun. Then in 1745, John Needham supported spontaneous generation by boiling broth to sterilize it and sealing it right after boiling, which would still result in the broth clouding, which we now know is because of contamination between the boiling and the sealing of the broth. And I know you're not going to go into any of the details of these experiments because it's entirely obvious to anyone that has even a rudimentary knowledge of biology why these experiments don't even address the issue of abiogenesis.
So Lazzaro Spallanzani conducted his own tests to investigate the criticisms of the skeptics. And he further substantiated the fact that abiogenesis does not occur. Rather, life comes only from life.
Again, I would like to point out that his experiments were on boiled broth. He attempted to repeat Needham's experiment while controlling for possible contamination before sealing. His method was to boil broth in an already sealed and partially evacuated container. He did so, and his broth did not cloud. But spontaneous generation lived on with the hope that fresh air was one of the needed ingredients for it to occur. And once again, boiling broth does absolutely nothing to demonstrate that abiogenesis is not a viable hypothesis.
Still, many were skeptical. Then in 1864, French scientist Louis Pasteur conducted experiments which drove nails into the coffin of spontaneous generation.
Yep, he sure did. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to what his experiments were? He boiled broth. This time in a swan neck flask, which allowed the free flow of air but would not allow the falling of particles into the broth. The flask remained free of growth for an extended period of time and clouded quickly once the flask was rotated to allow falling particles in. Of course, the experiment was not perfect and the idea lingered on for a few more years, but Pasteur's experiment is largely seen as having settled the matter. Once again, though, boiled broth is completely, 100% irrelevant to the study of prebiotic life. The only reason I left this section in, rather than just quickly dismissing it for being completely misleading and purposely muddying the waters, are because you actually went through the history of the various people who experimented in the field, and I thought it was interesting. But, of course, you had to leave out the most interesting parts, because if you actually discuss the subject thoroughly, it becomes very clear why these experiments are completely irrelevant to the point that you're trying to make.
And yet, sadly, naturalists simply refuse to accept the conclusion from the scientific evidence. Instead, they pour endless hours and mounds of money into trying to get around the truth of the law of biogenesis. Just ignore the God option. Don't even consider it a possibility. Does that sound like a reasonable, unbiased approach to you?
The way you describe it, no, but let me ask you this. You have, in this video, completely misrepresented biogenesis, abiogenesis, and spontaneous generation, and you have ignored the specifics of the experiments that you bring up, and have purposely conflated spontaneous generation with abiogenesis in order to discredit one using experimental data that is not applicable. Does that sound like a reasonable, unbiased approach to you? Best case scenario here is that you have failed to do even the most basic research into the subject that you are presenting. That's if I'm being generous. More likely is that you have done at least some research on the subject, and you have decided to be selective about which aspects you present so that you can make your position look stronger than it is. So you are either completely ignorant on the subject and unqualified to speak on it until you do some more reading, or you are lying. Neither is a good look.
If atheistic evolution is true, abiogenesis must be true.
Yeah, if atheistic evolution is true, sure, I can agree with that. But maybe it's theistic evolution. Could you maybe examine how dishonest you've had to have been in order to support your position, and maybe come to the conclusion that you are wrong? You can still believe in God if you want. God and evolution are not mutually exclusive. But with the way most people interpret the ninth commandment, lying and being a Bible-believing Christian are mutually exclusive. After all, the Bible itself warns of false prophets who are wolves in sheep's clothing and tells you that you can recognize bad trees by their fruits. Is a string of lies good fruit or bad fruit? I would say it's bad fruit, and the Bible says that a tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. You are in a rather unenviable position if the Bible is actually true.
It's common for evolution-based high school biology textbooks to just come out and admit spontaneous generation is impossible, come out and state that abiogenesis has been disproved, and even give the evidence for that claim, like this biology textbook by the popular textbook publisher Prentice Hall. After discussing Pasteur's experiments, the authors say the hypothesis of spontaneous generation was finally disproved. They then proceed, literally on the next page, to promote evolution and the origin of life from non-life.
I would be willing to bet that this is because they actually discussed the details of Pasteur's experiment, and they didn't feel the need to clarify that it's not relevant to the origin of life research because nobody except creationists have ever pretended otherwise. I'm still waiting for you to even give a summary of what Pasteur actually did in his experiment. I feel like I will be waiting a very long time.
Sir Fred Hoyle, who was a distinguished atheistic British astronomer, and Chandra Wickramasinghe, professor of astronomy and applied mathematics at University College in Wales, who I've quoted in previous sessions, he said, "The probability of life originating at random is so utterly minuscule as to make the random concept absurd."
Fred Hoyle also said, "It is better to be interesting and wrong than boring and right." He's the kind of man who would be different for the sake of being different. And yes, he did get a lot right, but I don't think his argument that God is the universe and the universe is God is one of the things that he got right. And your quote right there is right from the middle of that argument.
No wonder the McGraw-Hill Dictionary of Scientific and Technical Terms actually defines abiogenesis as, quote, the obsolete concept that plant and animal life arise from non-living organic matter.
I was legitimately shocked to discover that this is accurate. I expected to look up that definition and find that he had grabbed the definition of spontaneous generation and used it for abiogenesis, but no, this is legitimately their definition of abiogenesis. Well, I'm using the 1994 edition rather than the 2003 edition, but still, I can't see it being that big a change. But they do have a sentence that comes right after abiogenesis equating it with spontaneous generation, and the wording of the definition implies an idea similar to spontaneous generation. So the only explanation I can think of is that somehow the people over at McGraw-Hill fell for the confusion that abiogenesis and spontaneous generation are the same thing. I have looked up the definition of abiogenesis dozens of times over the course of my channel's history, from many different sources ranging from Wikipedia, the Google Dictionary, Merriam-Webster, Biology Online, BiologyDictionary.com, and probably a bunch more that I'm forgetting. And never have I seen it referred to as obsolete, except perhaps in the secondary definition that refers specifically to spontaneous generation. McGraw-Hill seems to be the outlier here. But as I said, I think they are actually defining spontaneous generation. You can tell because they're talking about plant and animal life arising from non-living organic matter. Since abiogenesis as the origin of all life does not posit the idea that a plant or an animal were the first organism, this definition does not apply.
But wait, if abiogenesis is impossible, if such a belief is considered obsolete, how could evolution still be considered credible by so many?
Spontaneous generation is impossible. Abiogenesis is unlikely, but possible. We do not yet know how all the steps that went from the first non-living organic compounds to the first living cell happened, but as life is just a series of chemical reactions anyway, there's no reason to think that the first life was not the result of a series of chemical reactions.
And how did life get here without some sort of naturalistic explanation if you're an evolutionist?
Through a series of chemical reactions.
Surely they have a rational answer, right?
Yeah, it's the chemical reactions.
When pressed for an answer to that question, many evolutionists literally throw their hands up and admit, we don't have a clue.
We have more than a clue. We have several clues. You can go to the Emergence of Life page on Springer Link right now and read about 30 pages of extremely basic, dumbed down to fit in one document summaries of our ideas of how abiogenesis could have happened. Everything from hydrothermal vents to the surface of the ocean to tidal pools to volcanic splash pools to pumice rafts, nuclear geysers, subaerial hot springs, and more. Just because we don't know how every step happened doesn't mean that we haven't got a clue.
In previous sessions, I've quoted from prominent evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins of Oxford.
Yes, a man who is known for his excellent quotability that doesn't result in any disagreements among atheists.
He's one of the leading evolutionists in the world.
He is one of the most prominent promoters of the theory of evolution. Yes, I can agree with that.
In the 2008 documentary Expelled, Dawkins discussed the origin of life with Ben Stein.
Dawkins says a lot of things that can come across as not great on his own. Now, combine that with creationists editing him to make him look bad, and dishonestly tricking him into participating in a film that he didn't know had a creationist leaning. He was told it was an exploration of religion and science, and then it's not surprising that he came out of that interview looking like he held some extreme and weird ideas. Though, to his credit, he worded it in such a way that even after their dishonest editing, it is entirely obvious that they were editing with a mission of making him look bad.
Dawkins said, "Nobody knows how it got started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life. It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule." Stein said, "Right, and how did that happen?" Dawkins said, "I've told you, we don't know." Stein says, "So you have no idea how it started?" Dawkins says, "No, nor has anybody."
Yes, nobody knows exactly how it got started, but if you'll recall at the beginning, he did say that we know what kind of event it would have had to have been. And we do have several ideas about how this event could have happened. But even if we manage to replicate abiogenesis in a lab at some point, it will still remain an unknown if this method is actually the one that happened on the early Earth. Really, there's so many possibilities that it would be hard work indeed to rule out all but one.
Well, of course you don't know how it could happen because it's been scientifically proven that it can't.
No, in this instance, it's more that it has been scientifically demonstrated that there are several plausible options. So even if we manage to duplicate one of these options in a lab, that will not rule out the other options, so we still will not know. There is a huge difference between not knowing something because there are many ways it could have happened and we haven't narrowed the options down to one yet, and not knowing something because there aren't even any options that we have considered yet. If one of my relatives comes to visit and parks their car in front of my house, I don't declare their presence to be an impossibility because I don't know which one of the many routes from their house to mine that they took.
So naturalistic evolution can't happen.
Nope. Once again, I would like to point out that even if abiogenesis itself were to be discovered to be an impossibility, we have enough evidence for evolution at this point that that would do nothing to discredit evolution. Life began a few billion years ago as simple unicellular organisms and has gradually become more complex until you get the life that we see today. That is a fact, no matter what is discovered about the ultimate origin of this life. To return to an analogy that I've used before, in building a Lego set, the manufacturing process that produced the pieces of Lego originally is irrelevant. It may have been injection molded, it may have been 3D printed, might have been CNC machined, and there are a myriad of other manufacturing processes that might have taken place. If you don't know which one was used, you are still able to build the Lego set, because while one thing is certain, the Lego did have to be manufactured before you could build with it, the method of the manufacturing ultimately has no impact on your building of the set, as long as it was done to spec. So if you conclusively disprove abiogenesis, which you're not even coming close to doing, but let's be generous and say that you quoting scientists 20 to 120 years after they made their statements, for the most part, which is a good chunk of this video that I'm skipping over, if that actually did disprove modern ideas of abiogenesis, then that still doesn't even begin to touch evolution.
Well, a recent response to the abiogenesis problem by evolutionists is just to try to dodge the problem. Don't even face it. Don't answer it. Just claim that the origin of life is irrelevant to evolution, since the theory of evolution supposedly has nothing to do with the origin of life.
Yep. Bingo. Hit the nail on the head. Though I wouldn't say that they have nothing to do with each other, just that the method life did use to get started doesn't actually affect the theory of evolution. Evolution just requires that life did, in fact, begin, and that beginning was simple. You can throw God in there if you want, because the fact of the matter is that it is still an unknown step. Just be aware that this is nothing but the God of the gaps argument.
But rather, it starts with life already in existence and proceeds to explain how various forms of life have arrived on Earth from that original organism.
Yes, evolution deals with the diversification of life that already exists. How that life got there doesn't really matter, just as the kid building the Lego set doesn't care whether the pieces were injection molded or 3D printed, as long as the pieces are there.
Notice that this new dodge only potentially helps you if you're a theistic evolutionist and believe some form of God jumped in and kick-started life at the right moment.
Not really, but sure, be a theistic evolutionist if you like. I have much less of a problem with them than with creationists because at least they are willing to accept the science.
If that's true, then you don't have to worry about explaining how abiogenesis could happen. But if you're a theistic evolutionist, if you believe God was part of the equation, why would you try to kick him out of the scientific realm as the bulk of the evolutionary community is doing?
I don't think that they are. They just recognize that throwing your hands in the air and proclaiming that we haven't figured this out yet, therefore it must have been God, is not a useful answer and won't get us anywhere, so they continue the investigation into the mechanisms that they believe God used. To quote from the organization BioLogos, founded by Francis Collins, an organization that is dedicated to harmonization of science and religion, one challenge that faces us when examining frontier areas of evolution is that many Christians have had exposure to such topics exclusively in the context of anti-evolutionary apologetics. In such cases, it is common for the arguments to have the following basic structure. Discuss a genuine scientific controversy from a frontier area of evolution, and then inappropriately use it in an attempt to cast doubt on evolution as a whole. This approach, though sadly common, misses the mark for two reasons. It fails to appreciate that a field of science is expected to have areas that are well supported, as well as areas that are more speculative, and that in speculative areas, the presence of competing hypotheses does not imply that the more theoretical base that allows the hypotheses to be made in the first place is somehow suspect. In other words, it is completely normal and expected for every scientific theory that is under active research to have frontier areas that are poorly understood, and these areas are not something that discredits the rest of the theory.
Why wouldn't he be allowed in scientific discussion?
It's not that God is not allowed in scientific discussion, it's that saying God did it and not going any further is completely useless in scientific discussion. Imagine if we had done that with lightning. We might never have harnessed electricity. Don't you find electricity to be useful? It wasn't until we stopped attributing lightning to God that we started realizing that this natural phenomenon with natural explanations has practical uses. And as scientists research into abiogenesis, our discovery of new chemical interactions will almost certainly have practical implications and already has had some, just as our study of evolution has given us the ability to predict flu strains and develop vaccines to fight them in advance, and the ability to develop evolving computer programs to help solve complex engineering problems much faster than human program software can.
Well, in reality, this argument is just a dodge from having to deal with the problem.
No, in reality, this argument is the reality of the situation. We are dealing with the problem by continuing to research the problem. Your solution of just believe that a god did it is a dodge that would have us avoid dealing with the problem entirely.
The theory of evolution is a naturalistic theory. It's not a theistic idea.
That depends who you ask. Certainly when studying it, scientists, even the religious ones, avoid proposing supernatural intervention as a mechanism, but that's only because it is recognized that this is a useless proposition and has never turned out to be the correct proposition in the past. Every time supernatural intervention is proposed, it is later found out to be a natural phenomenon that was not well understood at that time. Had you been giving a similar presentation before Einstein's time, you might have been using Mercury's orbit as proof for God, because that breaks Newton's laws of motion. But now we recognize that Newton's laws were simply incomplete, and the theory of relativity has successfully explained Mercury's orbit in naturalistic terms. The existence of an area of science that we don't understand yet is the whole purpose of science, to better understand areas where our understanding is incomplete. Supernatural intervention is not a useful answer to anyone who is looking to increase their understanding of nature.
It was never designed to be a model that includes the option of a god. Otherwise, the creation model would have been retained.
Newsflash: no scientific model was ever designed to include the option of a god, including the ones that you accept. You don't push a toy car and then marvel at the supernatural intervention that had to take place for Newton's laws of motion to make the car go forward, because we understand how Newton's laws of motion work in naturalistic terms. Same thing with evolution. You are welcome to see God as the overarching guiding force, but supernatural intervention is not necessary to explain it, and we have no reason to believe that it will become necessary for future explanations.
There's no room for God in the evolutionary model. If naturalism is correct, abiogenesis must have occurred at some point.
Which is why abiogenesis is an active area of research. We don't have the answers, but we want them. If everyone packs up, goes home, and declares that God did it, that will not do anything to improve our understanding of science, but continued research can and does improve our understanding.
The point can't be dodged. Evolutionists have coupled biology with evolution, and a study of biology must inevitably answer the question of the origin of life.
We have unanswered questions, yes, that's why we're researching them. You seem to be suggesting we should just give up, say, magic and go home. That seems to be your position. I don't like suggesting that that's your position, but I don't see what other thing you could be suggesting here.
So what are naturalists left with? How could life get started on Earth without God? Enter directed panspermia.
Nope, that sure isn't a solution to abiogenesis. $5 says he brings up the fact that the aliens that designed us would have had to have had a beginning too, as if that's some sort of gotcha that we were trying to hide or something.
In order to come up with an answer to the abiogenesis problem without conceding God, some are literally leaving the planet. There's a growing belief in the claim that aliens brought life here and seeded it billions of years ago and then directed the evolution of life since then.
I wouldn't really say it's a growing belief, it's more of an idea that's interesting to consider. The more accepted version of panspermia is more that some of the building blocks of life have formed somewhere other than Earth and came to Earth via bombardment. In other words, rocks with the right molecules smacked into the Earth. This is supported by the fact that amino acids have been found on meteorites, so we know that amino acids can form in space and can survive a trip to the Earth's surface through our atmosphere.
After all, if evolution were true, it would be inconceivable for there to not be life, aliens somewhere out there in the universe.
Yeah, I actually do believe that there is alien life out there somewhere. We know that Earth is really nothing special, and there are an estimated 40 billion Earth-sized planets orbiting in their stars' habitable zones just in the Milky Way galaxy, so the idea that there aren't at least a few 100 billion more in the universe at large is rather preposterous. If life could form naturally once on one such planet, surely it has happened more than once given the sheer number of these planets in the universe.
The show Star Trek, of course, is based on that idea and explores it. Hoyle and Rick Ramasinghe are on record as subscribing to this view, as well as Nobel laureate Sir Francis Crick and Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, Star Trek had one episode about that, yeah, but that was just their hand-waving explanation as to why all the aliens are just humanoids with slightly different characteristics instead of completely different organisms that in reality would be out there. And I like your little list of scientists that think that this is actually the case. You included Dawkins in there. Well, here's a clip of Dawkins saying what he thinks of the matter.
I, at that time, had never heard of Ben Stein, and I had been duped by a man called Mathis into taking part in a film which I thought was a serious exploration of science and religion. That's what I was told. I only much later discovered that it was a creationist front and that I had been fooled into doing something that I would never normally have done. When I spoke to Ben Stein, I took him seriously. I thought he was, well, until the end of that interview, as you saw. And when he asked me that question, something like, could you ever imagine any kind of intelligent design? I bent over backwards to try to give intelligent design its best shot. Its best shot for me was something like design by an alien intelligence, something like what Francis Crick and Leslie Orgel had proposed as directed panspermia. I don't believe in that. I didn't believe in that. I never said I did believe in that. But I was trying to bend over backwards to give intelligent design its best shot.
So, I don't believe in that, I didn't believe in that, I never said I did believe in that, is his explicitly stated position on directed panspermia.
Now wait. Before we go any further, notice Dawkins, one of the most famous atheists of our day, admits that there could be evidence of design in our bodies, in our chemistry?
Yes, he did. As he put it, he tried to take Ben Stein seriously and bent over backwards to try and give intelligent design its best shot. He made the mistake of thinking that the production company behind Expelled were behaving honestly. He was duped, to use his words for it. And if your argument relies on assigning a position to Dawkins that he has publicly and explicitly stated that he does not hold and never has held, then you must not have a very good argument.
Now notice also what Dawkins said about those aliens. Quote, but that higher intelligence would itself had to have come about by some ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously.
Yes. In other words, when speaking of panspermia, we are all well aware of the fact that this just pushes abiogenesis back a step. The evidence for evolution still holds, and this is not presented as a solution to the problem of abiogenesis.
So according to Dawkins, the supposed alien creators have been strapped with the laws of nature as well. They couldn't have just popped into existence. So he recognizes the truth of the law of abiogenesis and that it applies to the whole universe, to the aliens as well, not just to Earth.
So if you recognize that he recognizes this, why would you think that he thinks that panspermia is a solution for abiogenesis?
He acknowledges that biogenesis would still have to be in effect on the alien's home planet. So he admits that the problem of abiogenesis really isn't even solved by the alien seeding idea. It's just moved to the alien's homeland.
There it is. Y'all owe me $5 now. Pay up. PayPal link is in the description.
Another implication of the law of biogenesis comes from the work of Rudolf Virchow. His work illustrated that not only does life come from life, but cells come from other similar cells. Life comes only from life of its kind.
Yes, and notice the wording here. Cells come from similar cells. In other words, the daughter cells are not necessarily identical to the parent cells, allowing for variation. And once there is variation, there are selection pressures that will select certain variants over others. Now sure, we don't know how the first cell developed, but once it was there, all subsequent cells were very similar to their parents, and slowly the dissimilarities accumulated until eventually you get the vast array of life that we have today.
Robins make robins. There may be small differences in color, height, beak size, and so forth, differences in changes that we call microevolution.
Differences and changes that we call microevolution, which over time add up to big differences and changes that we call macroevolution. Easy peasy.
But even though there are changes, the offspring is still a robin. It's not a rhino and it's not a whale.
I'll have you know that my parents were robins, and that I hatched from their robin eggs almost 34 years ago now. I even have the video evidence to prove it. Checkmate creationists. Okay, that's where I'm leaving it for today. I was going to cover this whole video. Usually there's just a lot of fluff that can be skipped, hence my quick summary of part 3. That whole video is just fluff. But he goes into actual evolution stuff in the last 13 minutes here, and as I'm already running long, I'm going to have to save that for next time. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Scott Miller, who says, "Dear Mr. Rhino, I don't understand why you constantly pick on the intentionally ignorant. This seems to me to be so ridiculously easy. You must have some ulterior motive. Monetary gain, perhaps?" Well, Scott, if you must know, my main motivation is that the intentionally ignorant, as you put it, do a lot of damage with their misinformation. My channel is an attempt to undo some of that damage, and as similar YouTube channels were instrumental in undoing that same damage in me years ago, I do my channel. As far as monetary gain is concerned, yes, YouTube is currently my main source of income, especially now. But I did this for about a year and a half before I saw a single cent return on investment, and if I suddenly lost all my patrons and YouTube decided to demonetize my entire channel, I'd still do this, though admittedly at a much slower rate. I mean, I can't really justify spending the better part of most days ignoring my family if I'm not using that time to make an income that allows me to, feed them. And along those lines, I just want to say a very special thank you to my patrons today. You guys make this possible, literally. And several of you have really stepped up in these hard times, both new patrons signing up and old patrons upping their pledges. And I just want to let you guys know that I really appreciate that. And yes, I have lost some patrons to financial difficulties brought on by the pandemic, and I want you guys to know that I appreciate you as well, and I understand the need to lower pledges or delete them in these hard times. The last thing I want is for anyone to experience financial hardship because they decided to support me when they couldn't afford to. So thank you, patrons, all of you, past, present, and future. You guys fucking rock. Thanks as well to my PayPal heroes this week, Neil, Simon, and Beth, and to Anthony and Elijah, who sent me the neat little origami rhino. P.O. Box, social media links, and whatnot are all in the description. See you next time. Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today we're resuming the World Video Bible School's Science vs. Evolution series. I'm continuing on with the end of video 4, which, as you'll recall, was about whether or not life could come from non-life. I cut video 4 off early last time because after writing enough script for a 35-minute video, he finally started touching on stuff that I actually want to cover, so rather than make an hour-long video of my own, I decided to split that one in two. So let's go!
Macroevolution hasn't happened. So in nature, life comes only from life of its own kind. Dogs don't give birth to cats, and horses don't produce cows. Frogs don't have snakes. Apes don't give rise to humans.
One of these things is not like the others. And nobody thinks that an organism would have to produce offspring of a different kind than itself. It's just little differences that add up over time that start looking like bigger differences. Humans are not all that different from the other great apes. Our bodies have the same general shape, our faces are very similar, especially in juveniles. Hell, I went to the zoo once with a friend who is an evolution-denying creationist, and when we got to the gorillas, he couldn't stop himself from commenting on how much they look and act like humans. My kids used to attend a weekly educational program at that zoo, and their pickup and drop-off spot was very close to the gorilla exhibit, so while waiting for them, we would often sit in the viewing area and eat our lunch while watching the gorillas. The baby and adolescent gorillas behave exactly like human children, playing games with each other, cheating at those games, getting into fights that the mother would have to step in and break up, bothering the mother when she just wanted to be left alone, the older one picking on the younger one being a nuisance to the older one. It was fun, as a tired parent, to watch watch another species be put through the exact same parental challenges that we face. So, appearance and behaviorally speaking, we are not all that different from the other great apes. In fact, I'd say we're probably closer in morphology and behavior than a wild wolf is to a chihuahua, which is a relationship that creationists have no trouble accepting.
But if evolution is true, then that, in essence, is what had to happen.
No, that did not have to happen. Never would it ever be expected for any living organism to have offspring that more closely resembles a different species of already extant organism than itself. Were that to happen, that would throw a huge wrench into our understanding of evolution.
Simple, lower life sprang into existence, and from that, over eons of time, complex life came about. So according to evolution, life does not come from life of its own kind, but rather from other kinds of life, in contradiction to the evidence, the law of biogenesis.
I don't understand where the issue is here. We have seen significant changes arise spontaneously within populations of organisms, like single-celled algae that develop the stably heritable trait of multicellularity. It's still algae, but now it's multicellular algae, which opens up the door for all sorts of new developments. We've seen bacteria evolve to make use of a new food source. We've seen lizards develop new organs to help with the digestion of a new food source when introduced to a new environment, and that in only 36 years. So we've seen large-scale changes in populations of organisms, but somehow, slightly larger-scale changes over longer periods of time are completely unthinkable.
In the field of philosophy, there's a law known as the law of excluded middle.
Well, color me impressed. He actually named a law that's not one of the laws of thermodynamics, that is actually a law. It's his first time, and it only took, 4.5 hours of video for him to get there?
That law says that every precisely stated proposition is either true or false. So as long as we precisely and clearly define what we're talking about, we can know whether something's true or false.
Correct, but it has to be very, very, very precise, leaving absolutely no wiggle room.
If I say Bill is bald, well, as long as I precisely define what a bald person is, 100 hairs or less or something, then I can know if Bill is or isn't bald.
Well, no, because now I can ask questions like, do body hairs count? Or what about pointy sideburns that are at a weird angle? It's not precise enough to say yes or no for sure. Now, if you define bald as having less than 100 hairs on the crown of your head, now we're getting somewhere.
As long as I precisely define what a human is, and scientists have done so, then everything either is or isn't a human.
So do you care to share with the class what this precise scientific definition of human is?
According to the law of biogenesis, a non-human will not give rise to a human. So again, the evolutionary theory contradicts the findings of science.
Okay, so I guess you're not going to share the definition with us, so let's do that ourselves. Human being is a culture-bearing primate classified in the genus Homo, especially species H. sapiens. Human beings are anatomically similar and related to the great apes, but are distinguished by a more highly developed brain and a resultant capacity for articulate speech and abstract reasoning. In addition, human beings display a marked erectness of body carriage that frees the hands for use as manipulative members. Some of these characteristics, however, are not entirely unique to humans. The gap in cognition, as in anatomy, between humans and the great apes, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos, is much less than was once thought, as they have been shown to possess a variety of advanced cognitive abilities formerly believed to be restricted to humans. That's from Encyclopedia Britannica, and it looks as though that definition isn't quite precise enough to give absolutely everything a definite yes it is human or no it is not human label. It looks like it would be more of a gradient. But that's Britannica, a great source but not necessarily a definitive scientific source. So let's look at the Biology Online Dictionary. The simple definition is a bipedal primate belonging to the genus Homo, especially Homo sapiens, modern humans. Now, I'm not going to read through this whole page, but it does go into quite a bit more detail than the Britannica page, including a list of known human species, of which there are currently 16 members. So even if this definition of species is enough to apply the law of excluded middle, it still includes guys like Homo habilis, which I'm pretty sure most creationists put in the definitely ape category. And also there's that whole bit about relationship. Human beings are partially defined by their relationship to the other great apes. So if you claim that you are not related to the other great apes, then that means that definitionally speaking, you do not believe that you are human. At least not if we're applying the law of excluded middle here.
And requires that very thing to occur. Evolutionary theory is not in keeping with the scientific evidence on this matter, but the biblical model, once again, is in perfect harmony with the scientific evidence.
You are talking about the law of excluded middle here, right? Are you saying that the Bible defines things to be exclusive better than the theory of evolution? So, the word kind, for instance, is defined so precisely that we could know for certain in any situation whether or not two things are the same kind? Glad to hear it. Now make with the definition.
God created life, created it according to its kind, and told it to reproduce according to its kind. Genesis 1, 11, 20, and 24.
Great! Now tell us what a kind is so that we can use the law of excluded middle to determine which things are the same kinds.
The biblical model doesn't have the problem of having to make the evolutionary jump between various kinds of creatures.
Okay, but you're the one who brought up the law of excluded middle. In order to determine if something has indeed jumped between kinds of creatures, you need to specifically define what a kind is. Otherwise, you're falling into the fallacy of excluded middle, where you present a proposition as if the law of excluded middle applies, but it isn't defined specifically enough to actually result in only two options being available.
God created life according to its kind, and those kinds have remained constant since creation, with only small variations occurring, changes which amount to microevolution, not macroevolution or Darwinian evolution.
Well, I mean, I've already given you examples of pretty big variations. Speciation events have been observed, new structures have been observed, new genetic information has been observed, significant behavioral changes have been observed, and any sort of limiting mechanism that would stop these changes from accumulating past a certain point has never been observed.
The idea that life comes only from life of its own kind leads us into another area of science, which I'll discuss somewhat briefly. Darwin's evolution has itself evolved over the decades, since evolutionists have had to admit time and again that it can't work the way they thought it could.
Or could it possibly be that all fields of science evolve over the decades as our understanding increases? Like, would you say the change of our understanding of physics that resulted from Einstein's contributions was a bad thing? Of course science changes over time. That's a feature, not a bug.
The alleged evolutionary timeline has changed constantly.
Yes, as we learn more about the various aspects of evolution, biology, geology, paleontology, etc., we narrow down on the correct timeline. The change in our understanding of the timeline does not change what the timeline actually was, it's just us getting closer to the reality of the situation.
Dates change as to when various animals supposedly lived.
Sometimes, yes, we do find fossils that are outside the known timeline for that species, and this can cause us to reevaluate the known range for that species. But really, how would you expect it to work? Like, just for a moment, pretend that evolution is true. Now say we find a species in a rock layer that is slightly older than where we thought that species should be. Which would be the better option at this point? To insist that the find is wrong in spite of the evidence, or to adjust our conclusions to match the new data? I mean, as a creationist, I know your whole shtick relies on ignoring data that doesn't fit with your conclusions, so I imagine this is a hard thought experiment for you, but please try.
The order of evolutionary development has changed constantly.
Yeah, we have rearranged phylogenetic trees, and a lot of them still aren't fully settled yet. This is because the most accurate way to construct a phylogeny is with genetic data, and we just don't have genetic data available for any organism that is only known through fossils. So they are stuck using morphology for those phylogenies, and there is no guarantee that any of them are correct, and new data or new methods of interpreting the data can serve to develop new phylogenies that are potentially more accurate. And I know the way I'm describing this sounds like it's just a bunch of guesswork, but it really isn't. It's based on rigorous statistical analysis of thousands of different options for phylogenies and figuring out which ones are the most statistically likely using different methods. If each of these different methods come out with the same tree on top, that means it is very highly likely that that is the correct tree.
New theories as to why various animals develop their various body parts are constantly being revised.
The why this happened this way part of evolution is sometimes the most difficult part of studying it. When looking at one feature on an organism and trying to figure out which selection pressures work to develop that feature, you have to take into consideration the entire ecosystem that this organism lived in, and the ecosystem that its predecessors would have lived in. Ecosystems are very complex places where it is impossible to take every single factor into consideration, so it makes perfect sense that as we learn more about various ecosystems, past and present, our conclusions about features that developed in these ecosystems would change to accommodate our new knowledge. Again, it's a case of us learning more. Are you against learning? It's certainly coming across that way.
In fact, evolution itself didn't originate with Charles Darwin. Forms of evolution have been considered for millennia.
Yep. And this is true to a greater or lesser degree with every scientific discovery. In fact, there is a law known as Stigler's Law of Eponymy, which states that no scientific discovery is named after its discoverer. And while it is not a universally true law, its basis is in the fact that science is a very slow progression in our understanding of the world, with each scientist building on the knowledge acquired by the scientists that came before them. Sometimes with the big breakthroughs, a scientist will become famous, but more often than not, their breakthrough was just one more step in that progression, no bigger or smaller than the last one. It's just more noticeable to the public. And this applies to evolution as well. Darwin did some pretty amazing work on the subject, but he was not the first to propose it. And had he not done so, Alfred Russel Wallace likely would have been the guy that became famous for evolution, as he developed a very similar idea at roughly the same time as Darwin. To quote Mark Twain on the subject, "It takes 1,000 men to invent a telegraph, or a steam engine, or a phonograph, or a photograph, or a telephone, or any other important thing. And the last man gets the credit and we forget the others. He added his little mite. That is all he did. These object lessons should teach us that 99 parts of all things that proceed from the intellect are plagiarisms, pure and simple, and the lesson ought to make us modest."
And for millennia, those ideas have had to be revamped to stay in line with the latest scientific understanding.
Yeah. Our ideas change to match our understanding of how things actually work. We don't pretend that things work in a way that they don't in order to stay in line with our previously held ideas. And this is bad because... why?
Darwin came along at the right time in history for evolutionary theory to become popular, so he's typically credited with coming up with evolution, but it by no means started with him.
Well, you're downplaying his role quite a bit, but you're not entirely wrong, and it doesn't matter. We don't accept evolution because it has Darwin's name attached to it.
A fundamental component of his theory was natural selection. Natural selection is the idea that nature selects those species that are most fit or suited to a particular environment for survival.
So close and yet so far. Natural selection selects individuals from a species that are more fit than other individuals from that same species, with fitness here roughly equating to reproductive success. Having more offspring that survive to reproductive age is more fit. This will then have the effect of shifting the genetics of the population as a whole toward containing more of the alleles that gave those individuals the reproductive advantage. And if a population becomes divided and the divisions are reproductively isolated from each other, there will be slightly different selection pressures on the different populations, so several generations down the road they will be quite different from each other. Extend this out over geologic time, and you get the origin of all the species as evolution by natural selection. Hey, that sounds familiar. I think there might be a book or something with that title.
And those species which aren't as well suited and don't migrate to a different area, they're going to die out.
Again, no. Natural selection, although selecting individuals, is actually acting at the population level. If a population does not divide and become reproductively isolated, then it is likely that any beneficial mutations will work their way through the whole population, keeping the entire population roughly homogenized. It is when a segment of the population moves or is cut off from the main population that divergence happens. It's not about entire species being wiped out because they didn't move. Though that certainly is a possible mechanism for extinction, natural selection does not actually require that organisms without the beneficial mutation be killed. They just have less reproductive success. If you, me, and our spouses are all put on an island together, if I have 3 kids and you have 1 kid, then I had more reproductive success than you. Did me having more kids than you cause you to die? No, but the alleles that I carried and passed on to my kids that you did not have are now more frequent in our little population on this island. That's it. That's all there is to it. Now, it is entirely possible that your death was what resulted in me being more successful. I mean, if you died after 1 kid but I kept going, then that would be a factor, but it is not a necessary factor.
So it's a filtering system. And that's by and large true. The creationist doesn't have a problem with that idea. The problem is that Darwin believed natural selection could be the means by which his evolutionary theory could happen.
It's the mechanism that decides which genes become more frequent in a population. And between two reproductively isolated populations, different genes will come out as the winner. That's all there is to it. If you accept that natural selection is a real thing, then you already accept all that is necessary to accept evolution.
The idea that all forms of life came about from previously existing, less complex life, starting with a single cell eons ago. But scientists have realized today that Darwin was wrong about this.
Have they now? Really? Are you going to show any published papers on the subject, or is it just quote mine time again?
Natural selection alone couldn't cause evolution to occur.
No, by itself it cannot, and nobody disputes this. Darwin himself did not know what mechanism carried the variation within a species that led to natural selection being able to favor certain traits over others. But we know now. Reproductive isolation plus mutation plus natural and sexual selection equals evolution.
It might filter, but it can't create.
Right, that's the mutation's job. Well, I mean, not just mutation. There are other sources of genetic change like retroviruses, but no need to get too complicated here.
Evolutionary paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard said, "The essence of Darwinism lies in a single phrase. Natural selection is the creative force of evolutionary change. No one denies that selection will play a negative role in eliminating the unfit. Darwinian theories require that it create the fit as well."
Yes, Stephen Jay Gould, of course. Before looking this up, I'm going to give my guess. This is him talking about the debate between gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Because, inevitably, any time a creationist quotes Gould, that is always what it ends up being. Because Gould will just point out some flaw with gradualism, and then creationists will remove the context of the debate about gradualism and present it as if he's talking about the theory of evolution as a whole. So now to look up the article. Okay, so now that I've read it in context, I was entirely correct. And it looks like what I said in my video on Friday about us eventually discovering that evolution happens gradually in the genetic code without large morphological changes, followed by sudden morphological changes that rely on the previous genetic changes, places me in the punctuated equilibrium camp. And here I thought I was being diplomatic. So that's basically what this essay was about. The phrase hopeful monster, which is the title of the essay, was originally a criticism against punctuated equilibrium. The idea that an entire new species could show up rapidly, fully formed. So in this essay, Gould explains how it appears sudden morphologically, but it relies on a gradual accumulation of genetic change which build the foundation of the sudden change.
And therein lies the problem. Evolutionists recognize that they can't even claim that natural selection could create the fit. Dutch evolutionary botanist Hugo de Vries long ago said, "Natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest." So evolutionists have realized that natural selection can't cut it.
Which was said in 1905, before we had a very good understanding of genetics or how they work or what they even are. So it's a good thing then that we now have several mechanisms that do explain the arrival of the fittest.
Enter neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism is the idea that natural selection coupled with genetic mutations, DNA accidents, provides the mechanism for evolution to occur. So the idea is that every now and then a beneficial mutation might accidentally happen and it'll stick around without being selected out of existence because it accidentally makes a species more fit than other species that don't have that mutation.
You know, probably the most frustrating thing about you is that you hit relatively close to the mark at times when describing some of these processes, but then you just get all of the details muddled up at the end. So you're close when you say species because evolution acts at the population level. Natural selection, though, can act both at the population level and on the individual level. Natural selection doesn't cull a species out because a different species develops some beneficial mutation. That is a possibility, but it's just one potential outcome. But if an individual within a species has a beneficial mutation, then that individual will have more reproductive success, and so that individual's genes will, over time, become more common in the population, as its offspring have slightly better reproductive success than the other members of the species without that mutation. You're making it sound like it's some binary thing. This one beneficial mutation develops, everything without the beneficial mutation must die. But that's not how it works. Life is not black and white, it's a gradient. Some individuals will be slightly more fit than others, some will be slightly less fit, some will be a lot more fit than others, and some will be a lot less fit. and everything in between.
But that claim has problems because genetic mutations don't create new raw material or information.
Yep, they do. Duplications happen. Insertions happen. Retroviruses inserting regulatory code happens. We know many mechanisms that create new raw material and information, and the best that creationists can say to refute this is that a copy of already existing information is not itself new information, completely missing the point that now there are two copies of a gene that will accumulate their own individual mutations. They will not mutate in an identical fashion. So now we have a gene that does whatever the gene did before, but since it's redundant, it can mutate new functions without harming the organism by removing the old function,
which is necessary for the kind of change required by evolutionary theory. Speaking of that issue, British engineer and physicist Alan Hayward said, "Mutations do not appear to bring progressive changes. Genes seem to be built so as to allow changes to occur within certain narrow limits and to prevent those limits from being crossed. To oversimplify a little, mutations very easily produce new varieties within a species and might occasionally produce a new, though similar, species. But despite enormous efforts by experimenters and breeders, mutations seem unable to produce entirely new forms of life."
Yes, Alan Hayward, because when discussing what it is possible for genetic mutations to accomplish in biology, it's important to quote a physicist. And it bears mentioning that Hayward was very much convinced of the fact that the Earth and universe are old, and admitted in his book that the succession found in the fossil record is undeniable, but attributed that instead to several individual creation events with God tweaking and testing the various designs. In the book that you are quoting from, he discusses all of the major creationist arguments for a young Earth, and explains why they do not hold up. But yeah, he said mutations have limitations on them, so you quote that and ignore the rest.
Have you ever made a copy of a PDF on your computer or downloaded a copy of a PDF and opened it and found that errors had happened in the copying process?
No, because computers are better at checking for errors than our genetic material is.
Those errors are like mutations in genetics. Maybe individual words were messed up, a few letters of a word were changed to other letters, termed codon errors in genetics. Maybe duplications could occur, which is the idea that words, sentences, even entire paragraphs could be duplicated in the book somewhere. Translocation could occur, which is the idea that chunks from one part of the book could just be moved from one area of the book and inserted into another area. Deletion could occur, which is the idea that chunks of the book could just be lost. These kinds of errors or mutations can occur, and there are others, but notice no new material is written when these errors or mutations occur.
Wow, you are so close. But this is kind of a bad analogy, and as much as I have often said that a computer programming language is not a proper analogy for DNA, it is a better analogy than the one that you're using here, and I have given a demonstration of this before, so here's past Rhino to explain it. So here's a Python script, just 7 lines of code. It simply draws 10 circles in a row overlapping. Now, through a duplication mutation, the entire code is copied out again, which results in 20 overlapping circles. And if there's a point mutation that changes this FD to an RT, we get 20 circles in a line that curve downward after the first 10. If we then get another point mutation that changes this number from a 10 to a 20, now we have 20 circles in a line that curve downward after the first 10, with the first 10 circles being twice the size of the last 10. But I cheated, I hear the creationists say. I started with a whole genome duplication. That's not fair. Well, it is fair because whole genome duplications really are a thing, but let's do this all again in a different order to see what happens. We'll start by changing this 1 to a 2, and then we get 10 half-size circles. Now we change this FD to an RT, and we get the half-size circles curving downward. Time for a whole genome duplication event, and now we have twice as many half-size circle curving around almost as if inside a bigger circle. Now let's take one step further and change this 0 to a 4, and we get this spirograph-looking circle filled with smaller circles. So that's some simple mutations of the kind that happen all the time in nature that result in changes that do not glitch everything out. It changes how the program works without breaking the program. Sure, there are more ways to change the code that would end up with it breaking the program, but in our little analogy, the code is copied almost perfectly every time, and the ones that change for the better are copied more times than the ones that stay the same or are changed for the worse. And of course, better or worse in living things is mostly a function of their environment, so something that might seem like it's a change for the worse could actually be beneficial. So depending on our code's environment, the pretty spirograph circle of circles might be detrimental when compared to the line of large circles with the curved small circles, or vice versa. And should these codes become genetically isolated somehow, remember the actual lines of code are the genes in this little analogy, it could be that the first variant is favored in whatever environment it finds itself in, and the second variant is favored in a different environment. Continue the changes after the split, and you will get two very different looking programs. Add sexual reproduction into the mix and it gets even more varied and complicated. Thanks, Past Rhino.
A new sentence hasn't been written into the PDF.
No, but a duplicated sentence has been written into the PDF. And small changes to existing material can have a profound impact on that material. For instance, if you say, we invited the strippers, JFK, and Stalin, then have a deletion mutation remove one comma, you now have, we invited the strippers, JFK, and Stalin, which has a completely different meaning with just that one little change. And that's just a one-character change. And also that's why you should always use the Oxford comma.
Codon errors, duplications, translocations, and deletions. These are mutations, but mutations don't add new information. They simply change something that already exists.
Yes, mutations change things that already exist. Now, insertions do straight up insert new genetic material into the DNA, but let's just ignore that and focus on the duplications for now. They duplicate something that already exists, and then other mutations change this thing that already exists. If you do not understand how creating two copies of something and then making changes to only one of those copies can result in something completely new, then you should have your PhD in mechanical engineering revoked. Like, take a beginner's course in any sort of 3D design program, AutoCAD, Tinkercad, Cinema 4D, whatever, choose whichever one you like. In most of them, they give you a few basic options for shapes that you can add. Using nothing but these few basic shapes, with the ability to combine them, duplicate them, and subtract from them, you can make some pretty complex 3D models. Hell, learn how to use Adobe Illustrator sometime. You can make some pretty intricate graphics using nothing but basic shapes and duplication with modification.
Evolutionists Lynn Margulis and Dorian Sagan came out and strongly expressed their disagreement with the idea that genetic mutations could be the mechanism for evolution, as neo-Darwinism contends. They said, mutation accumulation does not lead to new species or even to new organs or new tissues.
Yes, they did say that. In their introduction of the book where they propose the mechanism by which they think that new genes are developed. Now, I haven't read the whole book, but from reading further into the intro, it looks like their hypothesis is that the source of evolutionary novelty is from the acquisition of entire genomes from other organisms, mainly through the process of symbiogenesis. So that quote is along the same lines as the creationist favorite from Darwin on the Eye. Creationists will take a spot from the introduction that appears to support the creationist position, and ignore, in this case, the entire book that comes after it. Okay, so that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Lucas Hefner, who says, we know how both morality and motion work. To call a flavor good is to compare it to a good or bad thing. To call an object moving is to compare it to a moving or stationary thing. That being said, I'm confused why some say to have relative morality there must be a perfect moral entity, while no one has ever said to have relative motion there must be a perfectly moving entity. Good point. The religious will often say that our morality is an indication that there is an entity out there with perfect morality, which ours is based on. Therefore, there must be a God. But morality is not absolute. It is dependent on the situation, and you can usually get religious people to agree on that in some cases. Same thing with motion. To the best of our knowledge, there is no perfectly stationary entity out there that we base all of our measurements of motion on. We choose a reference point to measure against depending on the situation. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, especially Mark McManus, who are the strings that keep the puppet that is my channel moving and looking like it's alive. If you'd like to be my puppet master, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time! Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at part 5 of the Science vs. Evolution series from World Video Bible School. This one is called Do Science Textbooks Prove Evolution? I'll make it really easy for them. They do not. However, the countless hours of research that has gone into collecting and analyzing the data that the textbooks are based on do demonstrate evolution to be the mechanism behind biodiversity. So that's fun. Also, apologies for my squeaky voice. It's a little squeaky. I'm sorry. Let's go.
The law of rationality in philosophy says that a person should only draw conclusions that can be drawn from the evidence.
Nope, it sure doesn't. There is no law of rationality. The main thing that comes up when I search for the law of rationality is the law of rational indices, which states that the intercepts OP, OQ, OR of the natural faces of a crystal form within the unit cell axis A, B, C are inversely proportional to prime integers H, K, and L. I have no idea what this means, but I am quite confident that this is not just a fancy way of saying that a person should only draw conclusions that can be drawn from the evidence. But all that being said, I would agree that when looking at a scientific topic, one should examine the evidence and formulate conclusions that the evidence points to.
Evolutionists believe that they have found scientific evidence to support their theory. If it can be shown to be illegitimate, then evolution proves to be an irrational belief.
Well then, you've certainly got your work cut out for you, don't you? Between molecular biology, biogeography, homology, embryology, paleontology, phylogenetics, actual observation, and more, there is a boatload of evidence that points to evolution, and it all has to be discredited before we have any reason to start considering other options.
If you were to ask an evolutionist, where's the proof for evolution? You're probably going to hear a discussion of some or all of these alleged proofs of evolution that are on the screen.
Yes, all of those except embryonic recapitulation are indeed lines of evidence for evolution, though horse and whale evolution could be combined with fossil evidence to form one category if we're looking at it broadly. But if we're getting specific enough to get into horse and whale evolution, we also have hominid evolution, the reptile-mammal transition, and a few others. But I just want to make a prediction now. You see, comparative embryology is an excellent line of evidence for evolution, but it is not the same thing as embryonic recapitulation. Embryonic recapitulation was an idea in the 1800s that an embryo, as it developed, would go through stages that were representative of the adult forms of that organism's evolutionary ancestors. We know now what is actually happening is that the related organisms will have similar embryos during the early stages, but as the embryo develops, the different species embryos will diverge from each other to be more like the adult form of whatever species it is. But creationists love to bring up the fact that Ernst Haeckel, one of the main supporters of recapitulation theory in the late 1800s, fudged some of his embryo drawings to make them look more similar to each other in the later stages than they actually were. He was called out for that almost immediately, but here's the thing. It's possible that Haeckel has been raked through the coals over nothing. A good argument can be made that Haeckel's drawings were not intentionally fudged. He was a marine biologist, not a vertebrate biologist, and a number of his drawings were not from his observation of embryos, but from him copying other people's drawings. Add on to this the limitations of the technology that Haeckel had access to, and it's not hard to imagine him having just done the best that he could to give an honest representation, but just having been mistaken.
Biology textbooks typically have several pages devoted to discussing the evidences for evolutionary theories. In the next 3 sessions, we'll wade through this alleged proof of evolution and see if it passes the science test. Ernst Haeckel
called it, "Why are creationists so predictable? Like, come on, guys. Bring something new to the table every now and again. There hasn't been a truly new creationist argument in about 15 years now, and that was their first new argument in the previous 20 to 30 years. You guys have to pick up the pace."
German biologist and avid supporter of Charles Darwin, popularized the theory now known as embryonic recapitulation. He drew charts like the one shown. Embryonic recapitulation, called the biogenetic law by Haeckel, not to be confused with the law of biogenesis, but the biogenetic law. This is the idea that embryos, as they develop in the womb, repeat the evolutionary development of their species.
which has been shown to be false, which is why it is not used as evidence for evolution. Now maybe move on to how the gill slits in fish share the developmental path with the gill slits in humans. Now I know this is where creationists will point out that the gill slits become bones that are part of our jaws and inner ears rather than having anything to do with respiration, but they are bones that do not come from the area of the embryo that is responsible for the majority of the bones in our bodies. Instead, it comes from an area that shares a developmental path with the gill slits in fish, like they can trace it back to the first cell that it comes from. Now, there is more to it than that. I go in more depth in my video on embryology, so go check that out if you're curious. My main point here is that comparative embryology is alive and well and still supporting evolution, even if one of our earliest ideas about it when it was still in its infancy ended up being wrong.
Supposedly, there's a period of time when human embryos have gills and tails.
Gill slits, not gills. They never actually develop into gills. They are more properly called pharyngeal arches. And tails, yes, we do develop tails. And as is the case with many vestigial traits, they develop to a certain point in the embryo, and then some genetic switch causes the tail to shrink and be reabsorbed. A similar thing happens with snakes, where they start to develop stubby little arms, but then they are reabsorbed. Same thing happens with horses. They grow all 5 digits as embryos, 2 of them disappear entirely, and another 2 fuse into the bones that are on the horse's leg, leaving the horse with only 1 digit by the time it's born. It would be much more efficient for embryos to only develop the structures that are needed for the completed form of the organism, but that's not how evolution works.
The problem is that it was shown by scientists to be false decades ago.
I'm sorry? It was shown by who to be false?
It was shown by scientists to be false decades ago.
Ah, so it was shown by scientists to be false. And yet you claim
embryonic recapitulation is still taught in many biology classes today.
So scientists who learn how to be scientists by going to school and taking science classes, like biology, have proven recapitulation theory wrong, published those results publicly, and then continued to teach it to the next generation of scientists? Does this make any sense to you whatsoever? Why would they handicap new and budding scientists right out of the gate?
So according to prominent evolutionists in the more recent past,
and according to prominent evolutionists contemporary with Haeckel, Haeckel was wrong. Darwin actually had this one right, so guess whose version is the closest to what actually gets taught in science class today? But yeah, this is an easy target for creationists because there are many clues to our evolutionary history that can be found in embryos. So it's a fuzzy line between Haeckel's recapitulation theory and the more accurate idea that embryos of related animals will start off similar and diverge as the embryo develops. And creationists take advantage of the fact that this is a fuzzy line and try and equate the two ideas, and then use the well-supported science that shows recapitulation to be wrong to claim that both are wrong.
He not only altered his illustrations of embryos, he even printed the same plate of an embryo 3 times and labeled one human, one a dog, and the third a rabbit in order to show their similarities.
It was actually a dog, a chicken, and a turtle. Not sure why you would change that, it doesn't affect anything, but anywho, Haeckel was challenged on this fact in 1868, and he defended himself by saying that you can't tell the difference between those embryos at that stage. And given the instruments that he would have had available to him at the time, it is entirely possible that he was correct in this. But that doesn't really matter, he had corrected this in his book by the next edition. So he took an ill-advised shortcut and got caught, and then corrected his mistake. But by that point, the damage to his reputation had already been done, and as a result, his name will now go down in history, mostly associated with creationists trying to use his work to disprove evolution, which is only possible by completely mischaracterizing both evolution and a good chunk of Haeckel's work.
Haeckel perpetuated a hoax. Even many evolution-friendly biology textbooks admit as much today.
You really need to make up your mind, buddy. Which is it? Do we still teach Haeckel's recapitulation theory, or do the textbooks admit that recapitulation theory is not viable? You cannot have it both ways. Those are literally opposite statements.
Sadly, in spite of such admissions, biology textbooks still use embryonic recapitulation as proof of evolution. In fact, this statement on the screen is in the section of the book titled Evidence of Evolution.
So, wait. This textbook explicitly states that Haeckel fudged his drawings to make them appear more similar than they actually are, something that might not have been intentional but rather a product of a more limited technology of Haeckel's day. But because that sentence happens to be in the Evidence for Evolution section of the textbook, that textbook actually teaches recapitulation theory? Hopefully you clarify this or provide a better quote.
What about homologous structures?
Okay, so no, you're not going to clarify that. So allow me. Textbooks do not still teach recapitulation theory. They do sometimes mention it as something that is wrong, and the one that you just quoted happens to have it in the evidence for evolution section, probably while clarifying the difference between recapitulation theory and the actual embryonic evidence for evolution. But because they're talking about it being wrong in the section that just is labeled evidence of evolution, you take that to mean that they are teaching recapitulation as evidence of evolution. Nice. So, once again, we demonstrate that one side of the creation versus evolution debate has to completely misrepresent the other in order to make their points, while the other side just relies on the actual evidence. Now, if I knew nothing else about an argument other than one side's points rely entirely on a dishonest misrepresentation of their opponent, then just from that information alone, I would tend to side with their opponent.
What's that argument all about? Evolutionists argue that many vertebrate species have structures that are constructed from the same basic bones and therefore are similar.
No, it's more than just it being the same basic bones. It's also the order in which the bones appear. The entire vertebrate skeletal system, no matter which species of vertebrate you are looking at, has the same order to the bones, even when the bones are quite different. There's also the embryological homologies. There is no reason for horse embryos to have 5 digits if they did not descend from pentadactyl ancestors. There's no reason for snake embryos to grow legs. There's no reason for human embryos to grow tails. There's also the concept of analogous traits, traits that serve the same function but are evolutionarily independent. We don't just look for traits that appear similar, declare them homologous, and then move on as if we've accomplished something. The label of homologous or analogous only gets applied after the traits have been rigorously studied and determined to either be the result of an evolutionary relationship or have arisen independently. A good example of an analogous structure is the tympanic membrane in birds. It works the same way as ours and is very superficially similar, but there is good evidence that the tympanic membrane of the birds evolved independently from our own tympanic membrane. This is also a demonstration of the fact that we don't just give similar structures the same names and then use the fact that they are named the same thing as evidence for evolution. Bird and mammal tympanic membranes share a name, but do not share an evolutionary history.
Because of this similarity, they argue, as does this biology textbook, that homologous structures provide strong evidence that all 4-limbed vertebrates have descended with modifications from common ancestors. So similar-looking anatomical structures, according to evolutionists, are strong evidence that we share a common ancestry with whales and frogs.
Yes, because descent with modification is the name of the game. You could, through small modifications in each generation, move from a human skeleton to a frog skeleton or a whale skeleton. You wouldn't need to change the order of the bones, just change their shape slightly with every generation. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that humans are going to evolve into frogs or whales anytime in the future, but since we share a common ancestor with both frogs and whales, it stands to reason that the body plans will be somewhat similar. And they are. More than somewhat, in fact. They're pretty much identical.
First of all, it's important to realize that creationists don't deny that similarities exist between different creatures. Creationists don't deny the evidence. There's no need to.
While I do not deny that you don't deny that there are similarities between creatures, you did spend the first 7 minutes of this video in denial mode with the embryology thing. If there were no need to deny the evidence, then there would be no need to bring up recapitulation theory when talking about embryology, because that's not where anyone thinks the evidence points.
It always harmonizes with the true creation model. The problem isn't the evidence, it's the interpretation by evolutionists of that evidence. While the evolutionist says that similarities prove a common ancestor, the creationist says that commonalities prove a common designer.
So what? God was too lazy to design a back that is actually meant for bipedal walking instead of choosing to reuse his old design in a way that guarantees us back problems in later life? God couldn't be bothered to remove all of the unnecessary bones from our feet, instead reusing the layout of the foot that he had used before that also causes problems? Sure, you can point to homology and declare that this is the result of a common designer, but it makes your designer look sloppy and deceptive. And yeah, deceptive, because when you arrange organisms by their homologous structures, it ends up being a phylogeny that shows evolutionary relationships. So your designer was not only too lazy to make proper designs for their purposes from scratch, he also designed in a way that made the organisms look like they evolved rather than being designed.
In the same way, when God designed the lung to be suitable for life on Earth, One would expect a very similar design to be used in other beings that would be living contemporaneously on the same planet and in the same relative environment.
Yes, God gave us all lungs because we have to breathe the same air. Except fish need to do their gas exchanging in the water, so they get gills to take advantage of the oxygen in the water. But then there are the water-dwelling creatures who spend the vast majority of their time underwater, but have lungs like the surface dwellers. Yeah, that makes perfect sense to give whales and dolphins respiratory systems designed for breathing air. The idea that a creature that spends its entire life living in the water could potentially die of drowning just seems silly to me, especially considering the fact that gills exist. And there are other types of respiratory systems too. Some organisms breathe through their skin. Others have a tracheal system that's a bunch of tubes down their abdomens. And if you organize all these animals by their type of respiratory system, you find them in distinct categories, which also share other characteristics. And when you arrange them by the other characteristics that they share, the groupings are the same, almost like they evolved.
In truth, when examined closely, the evolutionist homology argument quickly starts to break down and inconsistencies arise. For instance, humans share very similar analogous structures with several creatures. Human structures share similarities with the octopus eye, the pig heart, the Pekingese dog's face, the milk of a donkey, and the pronator quadratus muscle of the Japanese salamander. But evolutionists would hardly deem these creatures relatives of man.
Quite the contrary. In fact, if you look at the animals that you showed, the ones that we have the closest relationship to, the other mammals, are the ones that we share the most characteristics with. You are correct that the octopus eye is analogous rather than homologous. Octopuses actually have better eyes than we do, but there's not a whole lot of commonality between the octopus and the humans. The lizard, though, that is definitely not as similar to humans as the three mammals that you have there, but it is a lot more similar to humans than the octopus. It's a tetrapod vertebrate. So if you arrange these animals by our similarities, you get the same arrangement as when you arrange them by our evolutionary relationship.
Even certain plants in the crustacean Daphnia have hemoglobin, as do humans.
Yes, plants have hemoglobin. Fun fact, plant hemoglobin is what is used in plant-based meat substitutes to give the meat the look and feel of being rare, so a veggie steak will still bleed when you cut it. And tracing the lineage of hemoglobin is one way that we study evolution. And just to add to the list of practical benefits of studying evolution, the study of the evolution of hemoglobin has led to the treatment of hemoglobinopathies through the modulation of globin gene expression.
Are these close relations of man?
Not a close relation, no. And that's why their hemoglobin is a different structure from ours. That's convergent evolution.
And another inconsistency, if similarity proves common ancestry, then shouldn't dissimilarity prove no common ancestry?
No, not at all. You see, it's not just about the similarities. It's about the pattern of similarities and differences. You won't find a frog with fur because only mammals grow fur. You won't find a dog with feathers because only dinosaurs grow feathers. You won't find an earthworm with a backbone because only vertebrates have backbones. And the more of these traits that you compare, the more clear the picture of the evolutionary tree of life becomes. And then we find that evolutionary trees that are constructed using completely independent methods result in identical trees within a reasonable margin for error. If everything were designed, that designer went to a lot of trouble to make everything appear related.
There's more dissimilarities between humans and other animals than there are similarities.
That depends very much on which other animals you're talking about. Chimps and humans probably have more in common than you'd care to admit, but yeah, we are quite different from octopuses.
So the homology argument only works when you pick and choose. In truth, it makes more sense that there was a common designer of these creatures who used certain structural features several times in many different creatures due to the fact that these anatomical structures are ideal for life in similar environments on this same planet.
So for whales and dolphins, air-breathing lungs were the ideal method of gas exchange? Your god wasn't creative enough to come up with some sort of hybrid system that would allow them to breathe both air and water? Oh, but wait, he did, because labyrinth fish are a thing. You know those fish that have both a gill system and a labyrinth organ that allows them to breathe air? So God was creative enough to design a system like that. He just couldn't figure out how to scale it up? And it just so happens that the only marine creatures to have mammal-style hair also happen to be the ones with lungs, and who feed their offspring with milk. etc. We don't just find something that is similar, declare it to be the result of evolution, and call it a day. It's about the pattern of similarities and differences.
The homology argument can hardly be used as solid evidence for evolution when structural similarities can easily be interpreted in another way, a way that doesn't contain inconsistencies and therefore is more in line with the evidence.
There are far fewer inconsistencies in the evolutionary interpretation than in the young Earth creationist interpretation. You haven't even successfully pointed out one inconsistency yet. And yet, I can bring up the issues with the bad design that can be found all over the natural world. But your designer is supposed to be perfect. The only way the inconsistencies can be removed from the creationist interpretation is if your designer was sloppy, lazy, deceptive, and, at times, counterproductive. If that's a picture of God that you're okay with, then sure, go ahead and continue insisting that there are no inconsistencies in your interpretation.
What about genetic similarities? Haven't scientists discovered that human DNA is like 98 to 99% identical to chimpanzee DNA?
That depends very much on how you are calculating the similarity, because it's not as cut and dry as just sequencing the two genomes and then doing a letter-by-letter comparison. What happens if a large section of genetic material is duplicated in one species but not in the other? Does that count as one change or thousands of changes? What about the fusion of chromosome 2? Was that one change or millions? The 99% number was arrived at by excluding the 1.3 billion bases that were part of these large changes like this from their calculations. But it's not how high the percentage similarity is between two species that determines their relationship. In the case of molecular biology, we can actually construct phylogenies based on single genes. That is, we examine the same gene in several species, compare the similarities and differences, and build a tree of relationships between the different variants of the genes based on a rigorous statistical analysis of sometimes thousands of potential trees. We will then use this data to figure out the lineage of this gene. We can then do this with multiple other genes and endogenous retroviruses, and there is a very high level of agreement between all the different phylogenies that are arrived at through independent methods. This is indicative of actual relationships rather than just the appearance of relationship. There is no reason that analyses of several different genes should independently result in matching phylogenies if they are not actually related. Now I'm skipping over a bit here as he gives a long-winded intro to a quote from a geneticist that points out that because in DNA sequences there are only 4 base pairs to choose from, 2 completely unrelated DNA sequences would be expected to have about 25% similarity just from random chance alone, which by itself has some significant problems that I'm sure are dealt with in the book that this number is being pulled from, but I just wanted to give you that statement as context for what comes next.
So using the same DNA comparisons that are used to compare chimps and humans, a daffodil is 25% human genetically.
I would like to see your source for that, because using the same methods that got us the 99% number for chimps and humans, I would expect the daffodil number to be somewhere around the 50 to 60% mark, roughly the same as bananas. Because one of the issues with the 25% similar in unrelated genetic sequences number is that it ignores similarity of sequences. 1 in 4 base pairs should match up, but there should not be long stretches of identical bases. The long stretches of identical bases are most likely for genes that code some of the most basic cellular functions that are shared between plants and animals. But it's actually pretty hard to find a reputable source that puts percentages on the genetic similarities that we have with other organisms. It's usually pop science sites that are trying to balance the line between being sensationalist enough to get clicks and being accurate. The first page that comes up for a search on this topic is an article by Business Insider. Surely, when looking for accurate information on evolutionary genetics, Business Insider should be your go-to source. Actual scientific publications usually avoid pinning specific numbers on our genetic similarities with other organisms in such simplistic terms, because the scientists that are doing that work understand that it is a lot more complicated than a simple percentage would indicate. Looking at the 2005 study that many popular science publications cited as their source for the 96% similarity with chimps number, I can't even be sure that I found where in that study the number originates. It looks like it might be from this section on insertions and deletions, where they say that the indel difference corresponds to approximately 3% of both genomes, but 96 as a percentage only shows up once in the entire paper with reference to how short covered insertions are. 96% of them are shorter than 20 base pairs. I'm not sure what a covered insertion is, but it is definitely not total percentage difference between the genomes. 4% shows up as how many genes have a faster than expected neutral substitution rate, so that's not the total difference between genomes either. So yeah, the only thing I can think of is that some pop science writer saw that approximately 3% difference in insertions and deletions, rounded it up to 4%, drew the erroneous conclusion that this was the total percentage difference between the genomes, and wrote an article about how we are 96% similar, and then was copied by other pop science writers a bunch of times. So these percentage similarity numbers are an excellent example of bad science journalism, nothing more.
Now, seemingly as this kind of realization about the genetic code is becoming more and more widespread, and as more research is conducted, some geneticists have begun to slowly move away from the argument that chimps are 98 to 99% human and therefore share a common ancestor.
No, it's not that geneticists are moving away from genetic similarities as an argument. It's that more people are learning the accurate science that is behind these inaccurate numbers, and pop science publications are starting to catch up. If you read the actual papers behind the pop science articles, you'll see that geneticists never have been using our percentage similarity with chimps as evidence for common ancestry. They have, however, found several independent lines of evidence for common ancestry while examining and comparing various genomes, but they are based on creating genetic phylogenies rather than just saying, a herp derp, these two are 99% and these two are 90%.
They seem to pick and choose what results they'll highlight based on what appears to support their theory.
Projection much? There are often raging debates in scientific publications. One that I recall seeing recently was a paper that used a revised generational time in chimps, applied that to molecular clock dating, and ended up with a divergence between humans and chimps that fit in with what we expect, evolutionarily speaking. Within months of publication, there was a scathing letter published that heavily criticized this paper's methodology. And then the original authors responded with their own letter. And then there was a reply to that one, and it keeps going for quite a bit. If geneticists are only presenting evidence that supports what they already believe about evolution, why was there heavy criticism leveled against a paper that came to the expected evolutionary conclusion? Stuff like this happens all the time, and that does not match up with your claim here.
Consider another factor which doesn't support their theory. DNA, the fundamental blueprint of life, is squeezed closely into chromosomes, and all cells with a nucleus have a specific number of chromosomes. If humans and chimpanzees were so close genetically and share a common ancestor, then wouldn't common sense tell us that we should, at the very least, expect them to have the same number of chromosomes in their cells?
Why, yes, of course. That's obvious. But chimps have one more pair of chromosomes than humans! Okay, now I've watched ahead. He doesn't actually address the answer to this that I'm sure most of you are already at least partially familiar with, so here we go. Chromosomes have a specific structure. In the center is a centromere, which plays a few key roles, most notably in cell division, and has a recognizable genetic sequence. At both ends of the chromosome, we find the telomeres, which are simple repeating patterns of DNA that also serve a few functions, such as the maintenance of the ends of the chromosomes. In fact, in great apes, the telomeres are always the sequence TTAGGG, repeated from 500 to 3500 times. These are two chromosomal structures that are easy to recognize. So chimps have one more pair of chromosomes than humans do, and yet we consider chimps to be our closest living relatives. So what happened to the extra pair of chromosomes? Well, if we look at chromosome 2, we find that it not only has a telomere in its middle, it actually has a pre-telomeric sequence followed by a telomeric sequence, followed by an inverted telomeric sequence, followed by an inverted pre-telomeric sequence, right in its middle, as if the bottom of two chromosomes just got stuck together. Now, if this were the case, you would expect to find two centromere sequences. And you do. The actual centromere of the chromosome, and a second non-functional centromere, and they're both separated by the telomeric sequence that I mentioned earlier that's right in the middle of the chromosome.
Consider this. A strict comparison of chromosome numbers would indicate that humans are more closely related to the Chinese muntjac, a small deer found in Taiwan's mountainous regions, than to a chimp, because the muntjac has 46 chromosomes, just like man. And a chimp would be most closely related to the tobacco plant, which has 48 chromosomes like the chimp.
It's a good thing that we're not just counting the numbers of chromosomes to determine relatedness then. Now, this might come as a surprise to you, but what is contained in those chromosomes is more important when determining relationships than how many of those chromosomes there are.
Clearly, genetic similarities or dissimilarities in no way prove a common ancestry.
The number of chromosomes is not a measure of genetic similarity or dissimilarity. To my knowledge, it has never been used as such. And I think that's where I'll leave it for today. I guess this one's going to be another two-parter. Today's comment of the day comes to us from DC Wilson, who says, Creationist. Evolution means any animal species should suddenly give birth to any other animal species regardless of how different they are. This was on one of the other videos in this series, and yeah, not to spoil anything, but in the second half of the video that I covered today, he brings up X-Men unironically. It's amazing. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, especially Mark McManus, who are the wooden plates that keep me printing fudged embryo drawings. If you'd like to enable my fraudulent activity, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time! Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. Today I'm finishing up with part 5 of World Video Bible School's Science vs. Evolution series, and I think I'm just going to leave it at this one. I know you guys are getting a bit tired of Dr. Jeff, and well, so am I. I try really hard not to throw personal insults around, but the more I watch of Dr. Jeff, the harder this becomes, as I think of more funny comparisons that I could make, and then get sad that I won't be able to share them with you. For example, he looks like the word moist took human form but hasn't quite figured out the whole blinking thing yet. Now, I may watch through the rest of them myself to see if there's anything worth responding to in the future, but this is the official end of this series. So let's go!
Now, that said, certain genetic similarities should be completely expected given similar body structures, physiologies, biochemistries, intended diets.
If you'll recall from last time, this was his follow-up to his pointing out that organisms that are extremely different from each other, such as tobacco plants and chimps, have the same number of chromosomes. Therefore, evolutionists should consider them to be closely related because the numbers of chromosomes match up. This, of course, completely ignores what is contained within the chromosomes, and now he's bringing up the genetic similarities that most organisms share because they are responsible for some of the most basic functioning of the cell. And yes, it would be expected that genetic similarities would be responsible for these similar structures and functions. But if there's one thing that a study of homology and analogy can teach us, it's that there are a myriad of different ways that genetic material can accomplish the same task. So there really isn't any reason for similar structures or functions to share genetic material outside of an evolutionary relationship. Because when they do happen independently outside of their evolutionary relationship, the genetic material is inevitably different. And you can trace the relationship of specific genes through the evolutionary tree using small differences in the genetic codes to map out the relationships. And when you do this, independently, for several different genes, the tree of relationship matches up quite closely, leading to the conclusion that it is an accurate depiction of the relationship. If God had created everything independently, he could easily have scattered these different variations throughout his creation in a way that didn't have them all matching up in a big tree of relationship. But no, he apparently wanted to trick us into developing the theory of evolution some 6,000 years after he created everything.
Humans and chimps are both mammals and have similar types of internal organs. We both eat fruits and vegetables, which means our mouths and digestive systems will have some similar characteristics. We both have eyes, ears, noses, mouths, fingers. We get sensory information from these body structures.
Here's the thing, though. God didn't have to create the other great apes. He could have made another organism that is wholly and obviously not related to humans to fill the same ecological niche as the other great apes. But instead, he made ones that look like us, act like us, and when analyzed both genetically and morphologically, appear to be very closely related to us. He could have made all the great apes except for humans marsupials, which would then have thrown a massive wrench into the phylogenies. He could have made humans in a way that doesn't fit us perfectly in the great ape category. There are a number of things that he could have done to make it obvious that humans are not actually related to the other animals, but he didn't do it that way. He deceptively made everything appear to be related, and then expected us not to believe it when we eventually found the evidence of these relationships.
So there's no doubt that there will be many similarities between human and chimp DNA.
Yes, many similarities, and slightly fewer similarities between humans and gorillas. And actually, humans and chimps are more closely related to each other than either is to the gorilla. And when you map out these genetic relationships, you get a phylogeny that is, within a reasonable margin for error, identical to a phylogeny that you would get by mapping out these relationships through morphology, or by tracing endogenous retroviruses, or a bunch of different other methods. These independent methods of tracing relationships didn't have to match up, but they do. Evolution is the most parsimonious explanation for this fact.
If a person contends that genetic similarities prove we evolved from a common ancestor, problems and inconsistencies abound, as we've seen.
I mean, I have seen plenty of problems and inconsistencies with your explanation of genetics. The main problem I see when researching actual genetic studies is that genes are really complicated little things that, even when well understood, can still throw us curveballs. This is due, in part, to the fact that genetic material does not act like a blueprint or computer code, with one gene always producing the same result regardless of anything else. Because DNA is a chemical, the chemical makeup of the cell in which the genetic material is housed, as well as its neighbors, will have an effect on how the gene ends up working. So you can't just look at a string of letters and determine from nothing but those letters what that gene will do. You have to know what environment those letters are going to be working in. But I wouldn't really expect Dr. Jeff to understand that, what with his demonstration of a complete lack of understanding about how anything works in genetics.
The evolutionary model is not in harmony with the evidence. It's not the reasonable scientific choice. It's a biased choice, a choice which typically starts with a baseless assumption, a rejection of all non-natural possibilities for the origin of the universe.
Not at all. Now, personally, yes, I do reject non-natural explanations for the origin of the universe, but I know plenty of people who accept evolution because that's where the evidence points, but believe that the universe was created by a god or gods. What I think about the origin of the universe is completely 100% irrelevant to the theory of evolution. The universe is here. Why? I don't know. But one thing I do know is that evolution happens in the universe that is here. Does accepting evolution necessarily exclude the supernatural from being an explanation for the universe? No, it does not. Creationists would do well to stop proposing that it does.
What about horse evolution? Hasn't that been documented in the fossil record? It's definitely been taught as such in biology textbooks for decades.
I'm going to make a prediction here. Now, I have not watched this part of his video yet, but I predict that at some point, he is going to bring up that quote from George Gaylord Simpson that is about how the linear evolution picture that is usually presented with regards to horses is not representative of how horses actually evolved.
Supposedly, the modern horse, known as Equus, has been documented as evolving from the small fox-like creature known as Hyracotherium, or the Eohippus.
If you're oversimplifying it, yes, basically. But in reality, this is the same as every other evolutionary relationship from the fossil record. We don't know for certain if Hyracotherium is actually the direct ancestor of modern horses, or if some other species that was closely related to and existed at the same time as Hyracotherium was the actual direct ancestor. But Hyracotherium is in the horse family tree. There is no question about that. It's just a question of placement.
John Rennie, writing in the prominent science magazine Scientific American in 2002, in an article titled 15 Answers to Creationist Nonsense, he said, actually, paleontologists know of many detailed examples of fossils intermediate in form between various taxonomic groups. A sequence of fossils spans the evolution of modern horses from the tiny Eohippus.
He gave it a really weird inflection there, but that is actually the end of the sentence. But that single sentence about Eohippus was pulled from the answer to number 13. Evolutionists cannot point to any transitional fossils, creatures that are half reptile, half bird, for instance. So that paragraph is not speaking specifically about the evolutionary history of the horse. It is just listing a bunch of transitional forms. So yeah, this popular science publication, when giving a quick list of known transitional forms, did not go into specific detail about the fact that we can't know for certain which species known only from fossils was the actual ancestor of an extant species.
So evolutionists tout horse evolution charts as decisive evidence of evolution. The problem is that evolutionists themselves, the ones in the know, long ago abandoned horse evolution as an example of transitional forms.
Oh, I feel it coming. That George Gaylord Simpson quote, it's right around the corner. I know it.
They're realizing that the evidence for a gradual evolutionary progression isn't even available. And so they've decided they really need another theory. They're now moving towards the belief that evolution is less of this straightforward progression and more like maybe a bush with many varying branches.
Yes, that was a shift in the scientific viewpoint that happened decades ago. A shift that was largely spearheaded by George Gaylord Simpson. We're so close, don't leave me hanging.
But that hardly fixes the problem with the theory. Actually, it makes it worse, since there's even more transitional fossils that need to be found to link species with their common ancestors.
It actually makes it slightly easier, as there are several cousin species that do well enough to fill the gaps of approximately what the transition would have looked like. A husky and a wolf are different species, but they are close enough that, thousands to millions of years from now, when looking at the descendants of the canids, a husky or a wolf would both be a good enough representation of their ancestry from our time period. Only one would be the actual ancestor, but both are close enough that you could still get a picture of what the ancestor looked like, even if you can't say for certain which one it is.
David Raup of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago.
Oh, fuck you. I want my George Gaylord Simpson!
He admitted 30 years ago, well, we're now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. What appeared to be a nice, simple progression when relatively few data were available now appears to be much more complex and much less gradualistic.
Yeah, it's not a linear progression. That's one of the most basic things you learn about the theory of evolution nowadays. It was once thought to be at least somewhat linear, but we have since learned better. This is yet another case of science making progress and creationists pointing to that progress and complaining that it's changed, so scientists must not know what they're really talking about since science changes all the time.
In other words, there's no evidence of transitional creatures linking various kinds in the fossil record.
Did you not listen to yourself while reading that quote? That is not what was said at all. He said that we have had to modify our understanding of certain evolutionary progressions based on an accumulation of more detailed information. The horse transition was modified. Now, he also mentioned discarding some. I'm not sure which ones were discarded, but the horse one was not. It was modified. In that particular publication, Dr. Raup was discussing whether or not natural selection is a strong enough mechanism to account for all of the change that we see in the fossil record. To continue on in the next paragraph after your quote, now let me take a step back from the problem and very generally discuss natural selection and what we know about it. I think it is safe to say that we know for sure that natural selection as a process does work. There is a mountain of experimental and observational evidence, much of it predating genetics, which shows that natural selection as a biological process works. And then a little later when discussing the fossil record, now with regard to the fossil record, we certainly see change. If any of us were to be put down in the Cretaceous landscape, we would immediately recognize the difference. Some of the plants and animals would be familiar, but most would have changed and some of the types would be totally different from those living today. This record of change pretty clearly demonstrates that evolution has occurred if we define evolution simply as change, but it does not tell us how this change took place, and that is really the question. And it goes even deeper than that. You see, Dr. Raup specialized in extinction events. So when he expressed doubts about natural selection, it was not that he doubted natural selection's ability to lead to great diversity, it was that he doubted that natural selection could account for the great extinction events that weren't as well documented at that time, each of which would have had a profound effect on the ecology of the planet.
The famous paleontologist of Harvard, George Gaylord Simpson,
Yeah!
way back in 1953, he summed the truth up when he said, "The uniform, continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature."
Oh, that felt so good. Thanks for finally getting me there. Okay, so when I went over this in a previous video, I wasn't able to track down the original source for that quote. This time, though, I found it. So last time, I essentially just used Simpson's reputation as being a key figure in the shift in thought away from the idea of goal-oriented directed evolution to interpret that quote. And I was right. That is exactly what this quote is about. It's followed up in his book with several examples where the evolution of the horse, when traced, shows several offshoots and branches with features that didn't make it to the modern horse. He then goes on to say that the evolution of the horse family, Equidae, is now no better known than that of numerous other groups of organisms, but it is still a classic example of evolution in action, and a very instructive example when correctly presented. Also, for what it's worth, he did give an illustration of the evolution of the horse foot, and included a couple of side branches to illustrate the fact that the development of the horse was not trying to get to a modern horse, but was experimenting with the different designs to see which would work. And of course, as probably needs saying here before creationists jump on the language I used to describe that, it's not that there is some force behind evolution doing the experimenting. That's just referring to genetic diversity plus natural selection. The genes just make a bunch of stuff, and they mutate randomly, which can be likened to trying different combinations of things. It's sad that this needs clarifying, but here we are.
So some evolutionists proceed to counter with whale evolution.
No, we counter with the fact that you took his quote completely out of context, and horse evolution is still well documented. And, as pointed out by Dr. Simpson, we have plenty of other organisms whose evolutionary history is at least as well documented as that of the horse. The horse just remains one of the classic examples. But yes, whale evolution is another excellent example of evolution in action in the fossil record.
Yeah, well, whale evolution is still well documented, though, so horse evolution is irrelevant anyway.
No, horse evolution is still entirely relevant. It's just not as straightforward as one of those pictures of it would have you believe if that were all you ever learned on the subject.
According to evolutionists, whale evolution is well-documented proof of Darwinian evolution.
Yep, it sure is. I mean, I could quibble with your use of the word proof, because anytime I don't, people mention it in the comments about how proof is only acceptable in math. But yeah, our documentation of cetacean evolution is excellent evidence for evolution.
Supposedly in this well-documented story, whales evolved from mammals that lived on land and that supposedly gradually moved into the water in search of food.
Well, I don't know about the in search of food part, but yes, whales developed from land animals that gradually became more aquatic for one reason or another. Food may or may not have been one of the reasons for that.
In a 2007 edition of Nature magazine, J.G.M. Thewison, who's an evolutionary anatomist and professor at Northeast Ohio Medical University, he claimed to have found the oldest and closest relative of the whale. Now here's the problem. For many years, the hippopotamus was considered to be the closest whale relative.
Hippos are possibly the closest living relative to whales, yes, but you just said that Thewison found the oldest and closest relative to whales, which itself is a bit of a nonsensical statement. I mean, would anyone be tempted to state that their great-great-great-grandmother, who died years and years before they were born, is their closest relative? And oldest relative doesn't make sense in this context either. The oldest relative of the whale is the last universal common ancestor, and maybe not even that. It might be something earlier. Are we really supposed to trust this guy to dismantle over a century of science when he can't even parse out the correct meanings of oldest and closest?
Now remember, the evolution of whales is supposedly one of the most well-documented proofs of evolution. Clearly that means nothing. If the evolution of whales is one of the best documented proofs of evolution, then all of their proofs should be called into question by the scientific community. Because Thewison claims that the evolutionary community needs to totally revamp its entire theory about whale evolution. Supposedly Indohyus, a small, stocky artiodactyl roughly the size of a raccoon, should now be considered the closest relative of the whale, a creature that looks like the African mouse deer. Now, if whale evolution has been so well documented, as evolutionists claim, how can such a major switch be made, seemingly at the drop of a hat, as though it's no big deal? Changing from the hippo as the closest ancestor to a small, stocky artiodactyl roughly the size of the raccoon, they surely can't be as confident about their theories as they led on if such a change can be considered legitimate.
Do you really have such a poor understanding of the subject? There's a huge difference between closest living relative and ancestral lineage. Now, hippos have been used as a basis for comparison with what might have been the ancestor to the whale lineage, But to the best of my knowledge, it has never been proposed that whales evolved from hippos. And actually, this is one of those moments when we see the theory of evolution being used to make predictions. In 1883, William Henry Flower described how he thought whales would have developed. We may conclude by picturing to ourselves some primitive, generalized marsh-haunting animals with scanty covering of hair like the modern hippopotamus, but with broad, swimming tails and short limbs, omnivorous in their mode of feeding, probably combining water plants with mussels, worms, and freshwater crustaceans, gradually becoming more and more adapted to fill the void place ready for them on the aquatic side of the borderland on which they dwelt, and so by degree being modified into dolphin-like creatures inhabiting lakes and rivers and ultimately finding their way into the ocean. He had some of the details wrong, but he was incredibly close to describing the transition, the fossils of which weren't discovered for about another century after he made his prediction. And it can go even deeper than that. John Hunter noted in the 1700s that there are numerous points in the visceral organs of the cetacea which far more resemble those of the ungulata than those of the carnivora. In other words, in the 1700s, John Hunter was able to point out that cetaceans appeared to be more closely related to the ungulates than to the carnivores. And yes, hippos are ungulates, and they are likely the closest living relative to modern cetaceans. But nobody that I am aware of has ever thought that hippos were the ancestors to cetaceans. At best, they were used as a starting point for comparison when describing what the ancestor of cetaceans would have looked like.
Now again, in this supposedly well-documented evolutionary story, whales evolved from land-living mammals that gradually moved into water in search of fish and water-dwelling prey. But now, according to Thewison, it seems that the mammals that gradually moved into the water in search of prey were not carnivores at all. He says, quote, "Clearly this is not the case. Indohyus is a plant eater and already is aquatic. Apparently the dietary shift to hunting animals, as modern whales do, came later than the habitat shift to the water."
Yeah, sure. We're not tied to any one specific explanation of why they may have made their move to the water. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter much. It would be fascinating to find out for sure, but the fact is that they moved to the water. Now, why would that be if it weren't for a food source? Do we have any evidence of any land-dwelling creature that might make extended visits to the water for reasons other than hunting food? It would be helpful if we could find an example of a deer-like animal that did that, since, the Indohyus is described as deer-like. Oh, but what is this? The article that you pulled that quote from recommends watching a YouTube video? And that YouTube video is of a deer-like creature that lives on land but can spend extended periods of time in water walking along the bottom to avoid predators? But it's not hunting fish, so clearly it has no reason to be in the water, right?
So with the discovery of one deer-like fossil, the whole alleged evolution of whales is swept aside.
No, the discovery of one deer-like fossil caused us to rethink the reason that whale ancestors had for moving into the water, an incredibly minor modification to our picture of whale evolution.
Whales didn't evolve from land-dwelling ancestors in search of food. Their ancestors were supposedly already in the water and were herbivores, not carnivores.
You didn't really read the article that you pulled that quote from, did you? It makes it quite clear that Indohyus was an aquatic wading animal. That is, it spent much of its time in the water, but it did spend some of its time on the land, like modern hippos do. So, no, we haven't found the ancestor of whales that was 100% terrestrial, but we do have plenty of transitions from semi-aquatic to fully aquatic, giving us an excellent picture of how whales evolved.
Not the hippo, a raccoon-sized mouse deer-looking creature. That's some pretty big changes.
What an idiot.
It seems abundantly clear that the evolutionist case is not as well documented as they pretend.
No, it's quite well documented. You just seem entirely incapable of understanding the difference between ancestor and closest living relative. Now, to be fair, the Science Daily article that you linked to did have a poorly phrased summary that described Indohyus as the closest known fossil relative of whales. I think they meant closest to the whale's land-dwelling ancestor rather than closest to modern whales, but as I said, it was poorly phrased. But you also had to be trying pretty hard to misunderstand it in order to get to the conclusion that you ended up reaching.
Now consider this. What do you suppose links the Indohyus to the whale? What was so significant about this find that made Thewison want to change the evolutionary lineage of the whale?
Well, how about we read the article that you quoted from to find out? Dr. Thewison and colleagues report key similarities between whales and Indohyus in the skull and ear that show their close family relationship. It's literally the third paragraph, and these paragraphs are not very long or technical. If you want a technical answer, perhaps consider going to the original research paper rather than relying on Science Daily to summarize it for you. I mean, you don't even have to go past the abstract to get to which details they use to place Indohyus in the cetacean lineage. We've got the structure of its ears and premolars, the density of its limb bones, and the stable oxygen isotope composition of its teeth. These characteristics are not found anywhere else among the even-toed ungulates, but are found in whales. There you go, easy peasy.
According to scientists, although Indohyus, as it is known, looks nothing like the whales of today, it shares certain anatomical features.
Like the ones I just mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, it looks like a mouse deer. It's nothing like a whale.
You do know that evolution is all about change, right? Like, yeah, we say that whales are ungulates. One of the characteristics of ungulates is that they have hooves. Do whales have hooves? No. But when you trace their lineage back through time, you find these little mouse deer things that do have hooves and are obviously even-toed ungulates, but also have characteristics that are unique to cetaceans. Ergo, these little mouse deer are part of the lineage that eventually led to modern cetaceans. Now, as we have seen, people have been suggesting based on other characteristics for centuries, like literally multiple hundreds of years, that whales are ungulates. Then, in the 1980s and 90s, fossil evidence started to emerge that supported this. Are you saying that God made a specific class of artiodactyl mammals that would be buried in the flood at just the right rock layer to make us think that they came right before all the other ancestors of whales and were slightly less aquatic than the other ancestors of whales, and shared characteristics that are unique to cetaceans but were clearly artiodactyls and not cetaceans? Why would God want to trick us in such a way?
Couldn't it just as easily be said that anything is related to the whale?
No, because not just anything has the characteristics that you completely ignored that point us in the direction of them being related to the whale. It looks like you read the summary of a popular science article, then skipped the first 5 paragraphs of the article to get to the quote that you thought was damning, and then didn't read anything after the quote. Once again, you are demonstrating that creationists, in order to make their points, have to completely ignore and misrepresent huge chunks of the evidence for evolution. I didn't even have to go past the article that you cited as a source to demonstrate that you are wrong, and the only reason I did is because I apparently care more about the truth than creationists do, and yet they claim to have the ultimate source of truth on their side.
Exactly.
Oh, well, thanks for agreeing with me. There you go. Creationism is done, folks. I can shut down my channel now.
The Wisson actually admits that these anatomical features are in fact shared with other creatures.
Oh, you're not done. Fuck.
He says, all of these characters are found in some mammals unrelated to cetaceans or whales.
Oh my god, you absolute numpty. You actually went to the original paper and you still came out without figuring out which features made Indohyus special. Okay, so going to the study, they do indeed say that. In the section where they are discussing whether the Indohyus find should cause a redefinition of what it means to be part of the clade cetacean. Up until Indohyus, cetaceans were identified mainly by the presence of the involucrum in the ear, because no animal had ever been found with the involucrum that was not a cetacean. But with Indohyus, which is clearly an artiodactyl, we now have something that is not necessarily a cetacean, but which has the involucrum in its ear. So either the definition of the clade cetacean needs to change, or else it becomes a paraphyletic group instead of a monophyletic group. Brief refresher, a monophyletic group is a grouping of organisms by a characteristic that is shared by all descendants in that group, so for instance all vertebrates have vertebrae. A paraphyletic group is a grouping by characteristics which are not necessarily shared by all the descendants of the common ancestor. So for instance the word wasp. Everything that we would call a wasp shares a common ancestor, but there are descendants of that ancestor in the same monophyletic grouping as wasps, the Hymenoptera, that we would not call wasps, like ants and bees. So the word wasp is a polyphyletic term, whereas the Hymenoptera is monophyletic. So they were discussing in that section which characteristics we should use to define cetacean, and though several phylogenies that they constructed showed great parsimony with some characteristics, these characteristics are not exclusive to cetaceans. They then go on, in the very next sentence right after the one that you quoted, to say, we attach particular importance to 2 character complexes that characterize basal cetaceans, constitute synapomorphic suites for the order, and are of great functional importance. Another refresher, a synapomorphic character is a characteristic that is present in an ancestral species and is exclusive to that species' descendants. They then go on to explain the two character complexes that they are using to define cetaceans, a certain structure in their teeth and the shape of the postorbital temporal region of the skull. And that comes literally right after your quote there. So once again, creationists have to completely misrepresent what is being said in order to make their point. Like, this is so egregious that it would be the equivalent of me pointing out that Jesus said in Matthew 5:38, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." So Jesus supports the idea of personal retribution. But then if you go on to verse 39, where it goes into the whole turn the other cheek thing, that shows the first part to not quite be accurate when it's taken out of context all by itself.
What about vestigial organs?
Yeah, what about them? They are quite fascinating.
If evolution were true, and human beings are the current dominating species in a long line of evolutionary changes, starting with an ape-like ancestor, not only would we expect the fossil record to reflect that, but we would expect at least two other things as well. First, there should be human beings alive today in such transitional stages.
Okay, that was a bit of a mess. Now, for starters, humans are not necessarily the dominant species on the planet. I mean, it depends on what you mean by the word dominant. But let's just let that slide and move on to the there should be human beings alive today in such transitional stages. So, as you yourself pointed out when discussing horse evolution, evolution is not linear. There is no one end goal that all humans are evolving into. There's just a bunch of different mutations that arise that can lead to different traits, and several of them might exist simultaneously, and if the populations with those different traits are isolated from each other, then evolution can continue in different directions, etc. So with this in mind, we would expect to see variation among humans. And we do. The fact that I can tell you apart from other human beings means that there is variation. It's really that simple. But you were probably looking for more specific traits, like, for instance, if one group of people were extremely resistant to heart disease, like the people with the ApoA1 melano mutation. Or if one group of people were extremely resistant to broken bones and osteoporosis, like that family from Connecticut. Or if one group of people mutated to take advantage of a food source that was previously unavailable, like everyone who can drink milk as an adult, which is still a minority mutation. Most people in the world are lactose intolerant, and those that aren't have inherited one of about 3 or 4 mutations that arose independently about 10,000 years ago. 4,000 years before the universe began? So, yeah. We see lots of people alive today in such transitional stages. In fact, it could be argued that everyone alive today is in such a transitional stage. We just don't have any way of knowing which features or traits will be the ones that survive millions of years from now.
In other words, we should be able to examine the human population today and find human beings in the process of evolving into better, supposedly more fit creatures.
Yeah. Like developing lactose tolerance, super dense bones, and resistance to heart disease. Sure, we do see that.
In the process of growing wings or a fifth chamber in our heart or something.
Why would you expect humans to grow wings? And what would be the purpose of a fifth chamber in the heart? I mean, wings would be nice, but there's no selection pressure for it, so it's not really expected. And maybe an extra heart chamber would be helpful. I'm not a cardiologist, I don't know, but what reason do you have for expecting developments like these?
In fact, that was the main premise of the old comic book series X-Men. But we see no evidence of that happening.
Oh my God. Oh my God. You brought up X-Men unironically, as if that's what we should expect of human evolution. That's amazing. Thank you so much for the laugh, buddy. This has been a fun one. I needed that.
We don't see humans transitioning into growing wings, being able to walk through walls, or gaining super healing immune systems.
No, we don't. Because that's fiction. You do understand what the concept of fiction is, right? It's when a story is made up. Now, sometimes in fiction, they do make up stuff in such a way as to make it sound like it might be scientifically plausible. This is science fiction. So, X-Men were written in order to have a bunch of people with superpowers, and evolution was used as the explanation for those powers. No actual scientist would ever expect evolution to result in superpowers like that. Unless you count extra dense bones as a superpower. Well, maybe Dr. Jeff is a member of that family. At least, his skull does seem to be incredibly dense. Now, you see what I mean? I try not to do that, but I have a really hard time with this guy. Like, he brought up X-Men, unironically. And he almost killed me.
In fact, as the Earth continues to deteriorate, in keeping with the second law of thermodynamics, we see the opposite occurring. More and more has to be done just to keep us alive as long due to the spreading of disease.
Yeah, clearly. That's why we all have to have 10 kids if we want 2 or 3 to survive into adulthood, right? Oh, wait. No, that's how it was in the past. Almost like you actually have it exactly backward. In fact, in a 2005 paper on historical longevity, life expectancy was 25 years during the Roman Empire, 33 years in the Middle Ages, and 55 years in the early 1900s. So our average life expectancy keeps going up, which is indicative of how we are deteriorating, and now it's harder than ever to keep us alive? All right, that's it for this one. It's been a fun one. That was a fun ride. But he just goes through a few vestigial organs next, points out that they do have some function or other, and then declares that they are now somehow not a vestige of our evolutionary history because they're not useless. And since uselessness is not a requirement for the label vestigial, it is entirely irrelevant. Also, I covered Kyle Butt making the exact same claims in an earlier video, so if you want details on that point, go check that video out. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, especially Mark McManus, who are the good vibes that get sent into the universe that is my channel. If you'd like to get all wooey up in here, you can support the channel for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. And with apologies, I appear to have forgotten to thank my PayPal donors over the last couple weeks, so I apologize if you're in the group that I forgot, but I've got a little list here for you. So thank you to Catherine, Delian, Scott, Yannick, Ronald, Alexei, Thomas, and Candida. So thank you very much to those fine people for sending me money and helping me to, buy food and stuff. Yeah. Other ways to support the channel, such as direct donation or my Amazon wish list, are linked in the description, as well as my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!